welcome all of you this morning to the Council for Continuous Improvement and Innovation. It's a pleasure to welcome you here. This is our 7th meeting. I do just want to remind everyone, if you are speaking, if you would turn your mic on, push that, make sure that little red light is on, so that when our staff is reviewing and going through the minutes, it's a little easier for them. Thank you all again for your commitment to Texas and for your leadership to help our state achieve outstanding higher education. Fred should be here shortly. Obviously, during session, he has some scheduling issues, so he is on his way, but he asked that I go ahead and get us started this morning. As you're aware, we have 2 charges as a council. So far, our meetings have been focused on the Council's first charge, which is to identify metrics for Texas international competitiveness by 2030. As you may recall, the 4 possible major goals for beyond closing the gaps that we're considering are: number 1, workforce, improving the percentage of graduates employed or enrolled in relevant fields in 6 months. Alignment, number 2, increasing the proportion of 8th grade students who complete a certificate or degree within 11 years. Number 3, value, increasing the percentage of degrees and certificates earned within 100% time. And number 4, excellence, ensuring that 100% of students demonstrate competence in their field. The Council's second charge is to develop a culture in Texas higher education that is dedicated to the continuous improvement of educational outcomes and all those components necessary for Texas to be internationally competitive. The second charge includes reviewing and recommending processes to increase efficiency and effectiveness across all higher education activities and identifying best practices in all areas of campus operations that have demonstrated success. To begin the process of identifying, reviewing, and recommending best practices, each of you has a package of hard copy material for today's meetings. In the packet are today's meeting agenda, the charges to the Council, the minutes of our January 23rd meeting, and biographies of our presenters today. Certain presentations and handouts in order of their appearance on our agenda today. Please note that Dr. Nasa Pedar's presentation is printed for you so that you can discuss it during his presentation. The PowerPoint presentations of our systems representatives are also on your flash drives. Information of interest that has already been sent to you via email are recommendations of the Ohio Higher Education Funding Commission and new development creating a lean university. Members of each of our 3 small discussion groups today for today's small group discussions where is that listed, Mary? Do we need to go over those now? Or we know who those are going to be at lunch? Okay, great. Thank you. Group 1 will be Fred Heldensfeld, Charles Matthews, Ray Messer, and Elaine Mendoza. Group 2 is Harold Hahn, Lee Jackson, and Brenda Hellier. Group 3 is Phil Dybel, Jerry Griffin, and Roberto Zarate.
You got close.
Well, not any better at horseshoes either. This morning we will hear from Dominic Chavis, who will provide us an update on the 83rd Texas legislative session, as has been requested by council members at our January meeting. Then Dr. Nasser Pedar, am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay. Might have a little West Texas twang in there, but who is Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Academic Officer of Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. He will provide the council an overview of some key characteristics of an alternative performance model and share his experience implementing a new business model and strategic plan at Indiana University East while he was chancellor of that campus. This will be followed by a more in-depth look at Responsibility Center management by Council Member Phil Dybel and Dr. Pedar. There's a note here that apparently in Indiana, they call the presidents of university chancellors and the chancellors of their systems presidents. Is that correct? Callum? Oh, we got it, David. Oh, goody.
It's in every other state, just to be more confusing. It's literally trying to be confusing.
Okay, well. That's our story, and we're sticking to it, huh?
See, I didn't turn my mic off.
Following this more in-depth look at RCM, we will have a panel of experts who will share how our institutions are using systems of accountability to enhance system and institutional performance. After our presentations and discussions this morning, our council will have lunch, and then we will divide into the three pre-assigned groups that I mentioned earlier. Each group will meet for about an hour to further discuss and reach small group consensus on recommendations pertaining to creating a culture of continuous improvement in Texas higher education. Today, we're asking that each group address the following questions. How can the council play a role in developing a culture in Texas higher education that is dedicated to the continuous improvement of educational outcomes? And number two, how can the council play a role in identifying best practices in campus operations? Does your group believe that the council should identify best practices, and if so, how? We will then briefly discuss a timeline on moving forward with Beyond Closing the Gaps before summarizing each group's role recommendations as a full council before adjourning. Before we get started today, I need to let you know that Woody Hunt has decided to resign his position on the Continuous Improvement Council due to his many other responsibilities and commitments. Woody will be a difficult man to replace. His service and participation have meant much to us in this past year, and we want to thank Woody for being part of this initial council and contributing to his works. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Dr. Melinda Valdez Ellis, recently promoted to Program Director of the Division of Workforce Academic Affairs and Research at the Coordinating Board, will now provide a brief summary of the Council's January 23rd meeting, including a synopsis of small group discussions and recommendations. Melinda?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Congratulations, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. Good morning and welcome back again, everyone. So the January 23rd meeting focus was moving forward beyond closing the gaps. And during the meeting, council members Jerry Griffin, Brenda Hillier, and Charles Matthews provided a brief summary of the council's previous meetings, including a synopsis of the council's work to date as presented to the Coordinating Board at their quarterly meeting on October 25th of last year. Following that summary, there was a discussion of possible major WAVE goals, that is, workforce, alignment, value, and excellence. And then members of the council met in small groups to discuss and reach consensus on recommendations based on the following two questions. The first one, again, was which of the WAVE measures are of primary importance? And all three groups unanimously agreed that the alignment goal was of primary importance among the four measures, and the remaining three, however, were ranked differently in importance within each group. All three did agree that excellence is difficult to measure, and they also felt that workforce would be better measured by whether or not there is an increase in wages post-graduation. The second question again was what process should be used for further defining, refining, supporting objectives under the primary 4+1 goals. And the groups asked that their coordinating board staff continue to research best practices in measuring learning outcomes to find a relevant way to make measurement more meaningful, easily tracked, not cost prohibitive, or have unintended consequences. Additionally, it was suggested to attempt to engage the institution stakeholders for feedback regarding the WAVE model. For the April 24th meeting today, council members asked for a discussion focusing on higher ed accountability systems, an update in the current legislative session, and an update on the timeline for moving forward with beyond closing the gaps. And as you can see on our agenda, each of those items will be covered today. And as Harold Hahn explained to us earlier, Dominic Chavez will be next talking about the update on the current legislative session. Thank you.
Good morning.
Excuse me. Good morning, Dom.
Good morning. I'll make sure Mike's on there. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to give a brief update on some of the legislative priorities of the coordinating board and where they stand at this point in session. I'll be operating off this sheet, which I believe is in your packets, this very colorful 3 or 4 pages. As you know, we are in the closing weeks of the legislative session. I believe there's 5 weeks remaining, or just short of 5 weeks remaining in the session. And so at this point, bills in the House are to the point that if a bill is not cleared the appropriate committee, it's probably in some very serious trouble. The Senate obviously has a little more flexibility, so things never seem to die in the Senate. They always have a means of moving forward, but we're getting down to crunch time now, just generally in terms of the legislative session. One of the things that we're experiencing is that there appears to be a much lower volume of legislation moving through the system, particularly on the House, and we probably speculate over the entire course of this meeting on why that may be occurring, but it's something that's been noticed even out of House higher education. There's been a much smaller volume of bills coming out of the committee. And so we don't know if that's going to change in the next week or so, particularly on the House side, and now they're going to start hearing Senate bills. So just overall, legislation seems to be, not a whole lot of legislation seems to be moving through the process, through the system over there. But what I wanted to do is very briefly walk you through some of the top priorities that the coordinating board identified that may be of interest to the council, and give you a status update on where they are. You'll see on the first page are what the coordinating board identified as major priorities, or tier 1 priorities. And those fell into 3 categories there in orange: implementing outcomes-based funding, reducing time to degree, and restructuring financial aid. Under outcomes-based funding, as many of you are aware, there are 3 models that are being recommended to the legislature this session: one for our TSTCs, the value-added model; one for our community colleges, the student success points or momentum points model; and one for our universities. You can see the status of those in the House and Senate there on your 2 right-hand columns for each of those models. The takeaway is this: the TSTC model has a whole lot of support. It was actually included in the budgets in both the House and the Senate version, which, by the way, the conferees have been appointed and are now have started their negotiations to finalize that budget. The TSTC model, the value added, which is 1C, the Texas State Technical, that particular model has enjoyed a lot of support, and it was actually placed in both budgets. So in terms of the strongest position moving forward, the TSTC model is in the strongest position. For the community colleges, it was included in Senate Bill 1, the student success points, in no small part because of the active engagement of the community college sector with those members who have now embraced the community college student success model. And so that is in Senate Bill 1, but it was only included in Article 11 on the House side. And Article 11 is kind of a safety net catch-all for things that if the budget negotiators want to add later, they can bring it up and add it in the budget during conference. But again, it's in the Senate version, so that's certainly a point for negotiation between the 2 sides. The model that's probably in the weakest position at this point is the university model, which was not included in Senate Bill 1 at all when it came out of the Senate side, but was included in Article 11 on the House side, which means it is a conferenceable item, which means it can be brought up and added to the budget during these conference deliberations. So again, just to give you a sense, the strongest position obviously is the TSDCs. The community colleges are somewhere in between, and the university model is at this point probably in the weakest position. But all of this is open for discussion during negotiations.
Let me ask a question about the conferees. Who would? I'm thinking of the Senate, but I can't remember everybody in the House. But Branch is not on the conference.
No, the conference committee was just appointed, I believe it was 2 days ago.
2 days ago.
And the conference committee is Chairman Pitts, Otto, Zerwas, Sylvester Turner, and Myra Crownover. So those are the 5 House conferees.
What is their relationship to the coordinating board on this issue? Does anybody have a...
We've been, obviously the coordinating board's been in throughout this. Chairman Otto has actually chaired the Article 3 portion of the budget. So he's been very familiar with the conversation on outcomes and been very involved in those conversations. So he's obviously the point for the education portion of the budget for the House negotiations. So that's essentially where we are with regards to outcomes, and we'll know in the next few weeks how all this shakes out once they start deliberating and negotiating out the budget. Because again, something to remember, there's been a little bit of confusion. Outcomes-based funding, for it to be executed for this coming biennium, has to be executed via the budget. Chairman Branch has a separate piece of legislation moving through the system, House Bill 25, that creates basically the infrastructure for developing future proposals on outcomes-based funding, where he has created a staggered approach to eventually ask the coordinating board to look at 25% based on outcomes. That legislation will not and does not execute outcomes-based funding. There's been some confusion thinking that if his bill passes, suddenly institutions, we will be doing outcomes on 25%. It does not do that. All it does is direct the coordinating board to collaborate with the institutions going forward to look at those types of models. But ultimately, the legislature has to adopt it via the budget, so they have the final say.
Chairman, let me ask one more question.
Yes, sir.
When obviously somebody went over and spoke to this issue, particularly for the universities, what kind of reception did you get? Were there a lot of questions? Do people understand that issue?
Yeah, I think again, this is even though we've had this conversation about outcomes now for, I think, 3 sessions and various iterations of what it looks like. And I think we had a very fruitful collaborative process during the interim because, again, Chairman Branch and the legislature directed us via House Bill 9 last session to work together to develop the model. It is still, for many of the members of the legislature, this is a significant change, particularly when you're talking about dollars and changing the way we put dollars, we distribute dollars to institutions. So much of it has been, I think many of the members want to make sure that the models are right, that there's not going to be significant changes, negative consequences. So, and understanding the metrics and how they work. So the coordinating board has spent a lot of effort just trying to educate members about how these metrics came to be, that this was a collaborative process with the institutions, explaining what the metrics mean, why we're doing them, and what the result will be. But again,
you got a letter from all the presidents endorsing this.
Endorsement may be a strong word. I don't want to put words in the mouth. There was. I do know that leaders.
I asked that in the form of a question.
Yes, yeah. There were leaders from. My understanding is that leaders from all the institutions, chancellors, presidents, et cetera, submitted letters to the governor in some form or fashion, if not endorsing specifically the particular models, accepting the principle that moving to outcomes is something that's interesting, something that they think should be considered. So that's in terms of the outcomes-based funding. Another major priority area was reducing time to degree. As you probably know, the coordinating board's been collecting data and reporting data recently about the number of credits that students accumulate or attempt on their way to completing a bachelor's or an associate's. And our most recent data shows that for a typical bachelor's graduate, an average bachelor's graduate in Texas has attempted 142 credits for a degree that almost in all cases only requires 120 credits. So not only is that an impact on the state subsidy, but those are a lot of extra tuition dollars and student debt, et cetera. We have a similar challenge on the associate side with 96 credits for a degree that typically requires 60. The good news is those numbers are coming down. We've had in past years those numbers have been a little higher, so we're seeing movement in the right direction. But the coordinating board had made some recommendations to the legislature on ways we might try to reduce that excess credit load as much as we can. The first there is under number 2, reducing time to degree, capping the number of hours for an associate's degree to 60 hours. I should say that 60 hours is the typical, but the way the legislation is actually written is it would be capped at whatever the licensure requirements are or the accrediting body's requirement is for that particular associates. So if the accounting folks say they need 68 hours, then it would be capped at 68 hours. But in almost all cases, 60 hours is what the accrediting bodies are going to require. So this is something that already exists for the baccalaureate. It's capped at essentially 120 hours for most degrees, or unless there's an accrediting reason why there should be more. So this is simply adding the same requirement to the associates. You can see here this particular measure is in 2 pieces of legislation, both on the House and Senate side. I think it's enjoyed some some success, and I think there's some consensus about moving forward on this proposal. The second proposal there was yes, sir.
I want to go back to something you alluded to, but I do think it's important to recognize, and that is that the numbers, since pointed out what the statistics were and the conversations begun, that the numbers have improved. And I think particularly among the four-year universities, it's been a fairly significant step in the right direction. And just so you know what the context is, it's because I don't think you had the numbers. It's dropped from 5.3 years to 5 years for those who do earn a 120 credit hour bachelor, and from 147 credits to an average of 142 credits in the last cohort.
Right.
So while there's still some room for further improvement in those, that dropping 5 credit hours on average in 1 year, I think, reflects some pretty substantial improvement. I think for the community colleges, that average dropped 2 credit hours.
Correct, on average.
So there's improvement there as well.
Yes.
I just wanted to put that in context for the council members.
So the second proposal there, number 3, and you'll notice that that's in gray. The coordinating board had made a recommendation. Right now, the way statute is written is that a student who accumulates 30 credits beyond what is required for their degree program at a university, not only does the state cut off the state subsidy for any credits beyond that level, that threshold, students can be charged out-of-state tuition. The coordinating board recommended, again, to create some perhaps disincentive for students and institutions to allow these accumulated credits to continue, to cut that threshold down to 15 credits beyond what's required for a degree program, giving some allowance for dual majors, double majors, and those sorts of things, because those are obviously legitimate reasons to accumulate additional credits. That legislation was not filed. I think there was a recognition, again, the legislative members appreciated the data that the Chairman Heldenfels just pointed out, but they felt that at this time there's probably other strategies they'd like to attempt or see play out. For example, there is one recommendation that was adopted last session to require all students to file a degree plan no later than once they've accumulated 45 credit hours. So that's just now been implemented. So that may be one way that those numbers will continue to improve. So while they recognize the challenge, this particular legislation at this time did not enjoy any support, and so legislation was not filed. And then finally, I'll just point out the restructuring financial aid. You may recall that when we entered this session, the coordinating board was looking at projections for Texas grants based on the growth of needy students and the reductions we saw, particularly last session in Texas grant funding, that we were looking at the potential that somewhere less than 20% of eligible new students may be funded if we received the funding levels, baseline funding levels that we anticipated going into this session. So based on those numbers, the coordinating board recommended ways to stretch Texas grants further so that we could serve a higher proportion of students, so we get more students into the financial aid pipeline. A couple things changed during the session in a positive. The legislature has decided, and again, the final number will be negotiated out between House and Senate, but the legislature has not only restored the funding that was cut last time from Texas Grant, but has also added more money into it. And so that was a very positive thing that we weren't sure was going to happen, that the legislature was going to invest more in the program. But what they decided to do, again, following current coordinating board operations, was to find a way to right-size, if you will, Texas grants. As you know, Texas Grant, the way the statute is written, that the award amounts are set at statewide average tuition and fees, which can be somewhere between $7,400 and $7,700 in today's tuition and fee structure. If we gave awards at that amount, you would serve many less students. What the legislature has intended to do was to follow a coordinating board policy that's currently in place to right-size a Texas grant to a target of $5,000 at a university and $1,325 at a community college or a two-year college. By doing that, they project, given the dollars that they're investing, that we may serve somewhere between 85% and 90% of eligible students this next session, or I'm sorry, this next biennium. So all that's to say that the legislative recommendation that the coordinating board put forward somewhat became moot to the extent that we've got more dollars, and the legislature has adopted this notion of targeting right-sizing Texas grants at a value that allows us to provide grants to more students. That being said, there are two bills that have pieces of the legislative recommendations from the coordinating board that you see there, and again, they only exist on the House side. First, I'll point to Representative Howard's that provides some flexibility and some structural changes to the program to essentially give the institutional financial aid offices greater flexibility in how they allocate Texas grant dollars to their students. There's a number of different restrictions and requirements in the statute today that in some cases handcuff financial aid offices, particularly when they're trying to stretch the dollars further. So Howard's legislation helps lift some of those so that financial aid offices can make local decisions for their students given the dollars and resources that they have. Again, within this context of targeting at the university $5,000 for a Texas grant. Her legislation also does another important thing that was a recommendation of the coordinating board. It basically pulls the community college and two-year colleges out of the Texas grant program. Now, on its face, that sounds bad, but what we're trying to do is move those students to serve them with the existing TEOG program, the Texas Educational Opportunity Grant. We have so many acronyms, sometimes I fail to remember them. The TEOG program currently serves community college students, but community college students can also qualify for a Texas grant. So you have two programs operating at the two-year level. It's not very. It's somewhat inartful. It can be confusing. They have different sets of requirements. The TEOG program is far more flexible, particularly for community college students in terms of part-time awards, the requirements for receiving it. So what we recommend and what her legislation is doing is to move the dollars through the budget that would have gone to two-year colleges via Texas grant, put it into the TEOG program, and kind of bifurcate the two programs so that we have a financial aid system where you have one program for two-year colleges and one program for for universities, so that it's a much more fluid, makes much more sense, and it serves their particular student bodies in more effective ways. The other piece of that, which is what Representative Villarreal's bill does, is because we've bifurcate those two programs, we want to make sure that the transfer pathway for financial aid between TEOG, two-year colleges, and the Texas Grant Program is much more robust than what is currently allowed. Right now, if you do not receive a Texas grant at a community college when you first enroll and you transfer to a university and you don't have that Texas grant, you cannot get a Texas grant unless you complete an associate's. And we know that many of our transfers don't carry an associate's with them when they move. They transfer before an associate's. So what Villarreal's bill will do, what his bill does is essentially broaden the transfer eligibility for financial aid purposes so that a transfer with 24 hours and a certain GPA, if they did not receive an award at the community college, can be eligible for a Texas grant when they move to the university. So again, these two bills, if they both pass in concert with one another, will bifurcate, create two separate programs, one for community colleges, one for universities, and create a more robust financial aid transfer pathway so that we can make that system work better.
Tom, in your explanation, you talk about requiring full-time attendance. You talking about changing the 9-hour, which is currently, to 12 or 15?
That was the original recommendation from the core name board when we had the broader recommendation for restructuring.
Was it to go to 12?
It was to go to 12. That particular provision did not enjoy a whole lot of support.
Really?
So the legislation that's moving through right now does not change the requirements on enrollment. It will remain at what in statute is 3/4 of full time, which is currently 9 hours.
Members, any other questions for Dom?
Mr. Chairman, Dom, with these two bills here, there's nothing in the Senate. So what happens if these two pass in the House?
And I will update you because this just happened last night. House Bill 2829 has now cleared the House committee. They held a hearing yesterday, a meeting on the floor yesterday, and they did pass that out of committee. So it is headed towards the House floor, assuming calendars places it. But again, the timing is we're in a crunch time. This has to happen literally within the next week to 10 days for it to have time to do what it needs to do in the Senate. So just passing the House, I mean, we're in crunch time. If this bill takes too long, it may not. The clock may run out on the Senate side. So because there's no Senate companion, it's kind of it has to run the gauntlet at this point.
Brett, I have one quick question on the grade out.
Yes, sir.
Do the institutions have any flexibility to implement that policy without legislation?
They do, yes. Currently, it's permissive. The current statute, again, it's said the threshold set at 30 credits above your degree requirement. The only thing that happens is, at that point, if someone takes the 31st hour beyond, the state won't pay for it. The institution then has the opportunity, can charge out-of-state tuition if they choose to, because they're losing state funding. We have heard that what institutions, I think, are being very proactive in this, and that's probably a reflection of some of the data that we're seeing change, is that as students get closer to this current threshold, not the recommendation, but the current threshold, that institutions are being much more aggressive in saying, okay,
you're running out.
You're real close to this particular degree. We'll make sure, enrollment management type, we'll make sure we get you these next two classes and move you on your way. So we do know that that's anecdotally has been happening at the campuses. So there is some flexibility in there to within the current statute.
That's.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
No. They cannot. They can only charge out-of-state tuition at the 150-hour mark, the 30-hour threshold. So they can't. Yes. No. I'm sorry. I misunderstood your question.
Okay. No. Your answer helped too. So, but Lee's right. That's the one I was wondering about.
Can I just ask one, and this is back to the outcomes-based funding. I was just puzzling over, I thought that a couple of sessions ago, and again in the outcome-based funding, that we were moving to paying for completion of courses. I'm just thinking what you were saying, maybe that's not true. It is true, right?
Well,
isn't it starting to become effective
yes,
now?
well, we started this conversation 3 sessions ago. The coordinating board recommendation.
I thought it was.
Yeah, the coordinating board recommendation at that time was based on the outcomes funding would be based on course completion.
Right.
That proposal there was not a whole lot of support for it,
Okay.
and so we started to move towards a degree production, very similar to what existed in the Performance Incentive Fund, which did exist for a couple of sessions, which was above the formula base. And that's when we changed the conversation from a course completion type of model to a degree completion model for the universities. And so that's where we currently stand.
So the universities are still collecting the money for just enrolling in the courses?
Correct.
Okay.
And if the current recommendation is adopted by the Budget Conference Committee, Beth, there is one of the 7 metrics is based on retention or persistence. In other words, one of the 7 metrics is based on hitting the number of students that hit the milestones of 30 credit hours, 60 credit hours, 90 credit hours. So there is a facet of that the University Formula Advisory Committee came up with.
And that's a good point that the chairman makes, because I think this is the evolution that's happened. You'll recall the course completion was a coordinating board recommendation. Last session there we shifted to this. We had 4 metrics for universities based on degrees completion. What happened, and why we're in I think a significantly different position this session than previous, is that the 7 metrics for the universities that are currently on the table were developed by the University Formula Advisory Committees. So they specifically added that retention metric as something that they felt was an important performance measure to include in terms of measuring their outcomes for funding purposes. So we have gone from a somewhat of a top-down, here's the metrics, to letting the institution formula advisory committees develop what they thought were the most appropriate to use for this model, and that's where we currently stand and what the legislature is considering.
Sorry.
Any other questions? If not, we'll move on. There is one interesting maybe note of reference, and that is that Ohio has just recently transitioned to, and this was led by a Blue Ribbon Governors panel of chancellors and presidents, chaired by Gordon Gee, a system of 50% of university funding based on outcomes and 50% based on course completions. So Ohio is now at 0% based on enrollment. All right. Let me introduce our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nasser Peydar. Dr. Peydar has been kind enough to join us from Indianapolis, Indiana, so I assume we're going. Oh, you're here in person. I was looking for you on the screen. You're joining us the old-fashioned way. Thank you. His full biography is in your handout materials, but in brief, Dr. Peydar is currently the Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Academic Officer of Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, which, what is the acronym for that? How do you?
IUPUI.
Okay. I thought there was a...
We don't say that anymore.
A core campus of Indiana University and Indiana's Urban Research and Academic Health Science Campus. Annual budget of $1.2 billion. His duties involve managing all academic issues and overseeing 22 campus deans and schools. Prior to his current appointment, Dr. Peydar served as Chancellor of Indiana University East, where he helped shape a living and dynamic strategic plan focused on excellence. Given Indiana's state budget and realizing the importance of increasing efficiency and productivity, he restructured the university and implemented a new business model that is based on RCM, Resource Center Management, As a direct result, Indiana University East has accumulated significant reserves, and Dr. Padar is here today to share his experiences. Dr. Padar, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be in front of you. Before I begin, I want to thank Mary, who has been talking with me via email for a number of weeks. She is wonderful. You have a great person here working with you here. She just does want to. We'll take her in Indiana if she wants to move. We'll talk afterward. I'm not a consultant. I don't sell anything. I'm passionate about higher education, and this is one of the reasons that I'm here, to talk with you, to answer any questions that you may have. I'm an engineer. I received my PhD from Department of Mechanical Aerospace Engineering at Syracuse University, so I talk in bullet items, and if I jump over something, please let me know, and we'll go over that. Before I share some of my experiences, let me just say some of the challenges that I see that is facing higher education. Regardless of where we go in the States, I think no one would argue with these. Student debt is one major issue that is facing the country, as well as higher education. The costs are rising at universities. The state appropriations are at best flat in many places. Major cuts have been experienced and anticipated to experience. States have so many other costs that they need to attend to. There is either perceived or reality that higher education graduates are not finding jobs. There is a de facto cap tuition in all universities. You don't see those major increases in tuition. So those are the issues that universities are facing. There are issues that the country is facing. Today, our education attainment in the country is somewhere around 40%. With any degrees, associate, bachelor's, master's. Many of our friends overseas, they have much higher percentage of their population with baccalaureate degrees. South Korea is 65%. We are at 40%, and they're growing. There is a change in the market. The type of skills that are needed today are not exactly what they needed 30 years ago in Indiana. Manufacturing was the way of prosperity for a community, and all you needed to be able to work there is work ethics. Today, you really need skills. I don't know about garbage trucks in Texas, but in Indiana, there used to be 3 people working in a driver, 2 people hanging from behind. Today, it's just one driver and an arm that picks that up. So we lost 2 people there. There are about 500,000 trucks in the country. There is a group of people that we have lost, and those jobs are outsourced to the past. That's the changing environment. That's the challenges facing the country and thereby universities. The other issue that I don't hear people talking about it is that we have done a great job in educating people that are born to wealth. Anyone that is born to wealth, top quartile of the wealth, they have 70% chance of getting baccalaureate degrees. If you're born to a family in the bottom quartile, you have 10% chance to get a baccalaureate degree. This is a national average. And so we are doing a great job educating people that we have been successful educating for years. And in order for this country to get to 60% of its population having baccalaureate degrees, mathematically it is impossible for us to only focus to the top quartile or the group that have been going to universities. We have no choice but to look at other groups of people that we have not been, as a country, very successful in educating. So these are the issues. I think most administrators, chancellors, and presidents, and by the way, you're correct, in Indiana we have it reversed. Chancellors and presidents are reversed. Most of them get it. The culture that we have in universities, which is something that we are very proud of in this country, makes it very difficult for a CEO, for a president, chancellor to order change. So we've got to change that culture, and I've had an experience where we were able to make some changes there. And I believe there are 6 factors, 6 areas, 6 things that need to come together to make an institution to move in the environment that we are talking about. 5 of those are up to the institutions. 1 is up to the states. One is state. One factor is performance-based funding. We all have talked about faculty wanting to do this, wanting to do that. Universities do this and that, and it's like herding cats. Well, I have done that. I don't know how many of you herded cats. I have done that. It's not that difficult. You take a bowl of milk, you move it there. These cats will go towards that. You move it there, the cats will go there. So one of these 6 factors is the performance-based. Because of all the issues that I just mentioned in every state, and I have had a close relationship and work with Montana, Maryland, Indiana, and I follow other states as well. Because of these factors, people, legislators, and others are making statements, are making demands, are thinking of these innovative ways. Some people are talking like they have been on 747. That doesn't mean that you can fly 747s. So I think that there are 6 factors. One of them is state, and that is performance-based, and that is if you wish universities to focus on degrees, and if you wish universities to focus on time to degrees, then connect the funding from state to these parameters. I'll go through this list, and then I'll get back to that particular item and state performance that I heard, the status here in Texas, and tell you how in state of Indiana done. State of Indiana by far is not a leader in higher education. But when it comes to state performance-based, I believe state of Indiana is a leader in the states. And I will talk about that very briefly. I also mind you that I started 15 minutes late. I hope that somebody took a note of that. All right. So the second factor is we've got to find ways, an incentive that goes, again, funds to students. You've got to turn part of the responsibility to students. You've got to, what Indiana University is doing, freeze tuition for anyone that stays on course and takes the program going forward. That gives an incentive for students to do it. You've got to give them, we give 25% discount for summer courses. You want to take summer courses? Quarter. I mean, my wife buys shirts. If there are 2 shirts, she definitely goes to the one that is 25% off. There is a commercial. Do you want this? So we give incentive to students. There are so many other incentives, and I don't want to take time on that part, but part of the strategy should be make these students direct their future as well. Give them a hand in doing it. The other one is universities have to be innovative. They have to think outside the box. They have to come up with ways of doing things that they haven't done before. Online technology is one such way of doing it. We've got to do it in a quality way. We have a population out there in every state that attempted higher education and they dropped out because life happened. That is the group, the low-hanging fruit that you can go to at the age of 35, 40, and say, come finish your degrees. But the way you do it, it's very hard for them to go back. And even if you book classes at 5 o'clock, 6 p.m., it's very hard for these people to work all day, have family, and go to school at night. It sounds great, but in reality, it doesn't really happen at big numbers. But make it available online. Make it available hybrid. Use technology in a certain way. So that was the third item. I think universities, the fourth item is university must find ways of cutting costs. They have no choice but to look at different ways of doing it. There are ways that businesses do. Shared services, if printing doesn't cost us this much and that company does it, well, businesses, don't say, well, we've been doing it for 100 years. We're going to print it ourselves. We ship it to another person to do it. So we got to do some of that. But there is one other thing, and that is RCM, that makes universities cut costs in a way that you will not believe. And that would be the subject of conversation at the next session, following the first one. So that was the fourth. I think we need to, fifth, we need to begin mixing academic advising and career advising. When we went to college, let me give my example. When I went to college in the 70s, you had academic advising like 98% of the time, and then in the last semester, you found a placement office, you went there, you did some interviews, you got a job. But I think from day one orientation, where parents, kids, others come, you've got to talk with them about careers, and you've got to talk to them about jobs. We all want that, but that doesn't mean we should cut English program and if everyone is aerospace engineers, I love it because I could talk with them about anything. We could joke, we could talk. Except NASA will fall apart. You need people to write. You need manuals to be put together. We need all disciplines. We don't want to limit it to just nursing, engineering, medicine, etc., etc. We have the second largest medical school in the country at my campus, but we also have huge liberal arts program. I always say it's one thing to train a medical doctor. It's quite another to make that medical doctor value the life that person is saving. And that's where the humanities and social sciences come into the picture. But as you offer these programs, give your students an edge throughout their careers. Have MOOCs, have online programs that attach to these courses free of charge, and let them learn about markets, how to make yourself competitive, how do you give them some skills that they could also use in business there. So career and academic advising should be together, and they should go together, and there should be focus 4 years, and not to eliminate placement offices, but have these attached modules go with every program, and that's what we are in the process of creating at IUPUI. And of course, the sixth one is commitment to quality. You've got to develop quality. You have to have quality. Without quality, you could do some of these for some time, but that will not be a contribution to the. So everything you do, you also have to make sure that the quality is there. So these are the 6 things that guide me in the work that I've done. As I said, I control 5 of them, but State of Indiana came up with State Appropriation Division in 2007, started moving that biennium on. That is, I think, terrific in the way of encouraging universities to move in that direction. Up until 2005, the funding for states were based on enrollment. You enrolled X numbers, and if there was a change from previous biennium enrollment change, you got money. You taught that many credits, you have this many credits, therefore the difference, you get money. That kind of went away, and they added more parameters to a point where there are 6 or 7 components that are being considered now as we speak for our budget this coming biennium. What State of Indiana does is that even in 2009, where there was no increases in the state appropriation, Indiana took 5% on top of everyone's budget, created a pool, and redistributed based on an equation. So these equations are used for new money, as well as every year redistribution of funds from one campus maybe to another. Of course, you can imagine that this could be not so popular with universities, because up until that moment, you had your money. That was a given, and then you had more. And now the equation is you've got to deliver in some of these parameters. Very quickly, I'll mention the parts that Indiana is considering now for this 2003 and how they do it. So, for example, most of it is degree completion related. And by the way, I'm not going over that presentation I sent you, and I don't see what you're looking. I hope you're not looking at that. Phil, can you see if everyone, so you don't look at that until I ask you. All right, great. Thank you very much, Phil. Phil has advised me, we've had a conversation several times in email regarding the RCM, that he is a very supporter of. So degree completions and efficiency is what Indiana wants to see in universities. So this is how they do it. A portion of the funds is given based on just pure degree completion, meaning they look at comparing the 3-year average of the number of degrees awarded in 2006, 7, and 8, and then compare that with the degrees awarded 2009, 10, 11. And the difference is if you have one extra bachelor's, you get $7,795 for that. So $7,795 for any increase in your bachelor awarded in the average of these 3 compared to those 3. You get $3,898 for masters and $1,949. So basically it's very simple. So you increase your degrees, your fund go away. And remember, money is taken off of the universities. So if you don't have any additional degrees at the end of the process, you will lose 5%. This is internal reallocation, that in about 10 years, if a university is not responsive, I mean, you could lose a lot of money, biennium over biennium over biennium, to universities that are responsive and move in that direction. So that's one. At risk is another category. People that are on Pell Grants. We all recognize that dealing with that group, meeting the needs, providing assistance is more difficult. Attracting even Pell Grants. There are universities that maybe the percentage of Pell Grant recipients may be in the order of 10-15% in Indiana. The campus that I was a chancellor of had about 60% Pell Grant. So because we wanted to go to that lower group of people and educate them. And so there is same equation again. 3 years, 3 years comparison. If you have one additional Pell Grant recipient, you receive $5,503. High impact degrees, STEM degrees, math, technology, engineering, etc. Same thing. Subtract them. If you have one extra bachelor's, there is 19,491, 14,000, and 6,800. So that gives you an idea as to how they reward campuses that pay attention to STEM. On-time graduation, and this is only for the others were any kind of student, but this is only first-time, full-time, and how many people graduate in 4 years? Because it's hard to measure transfers. So you focus on first-time, full-time. Same thing. The difference was going to give you $22,000. So you have more, 10,000. That's a lot of money. And then institutions are invited to define one parameter for themselves. Judge me based on this. And then there is some reward for that. And each institution has its own parameter for that. So this is the way performance-based funding works in Indiana. There are maybe about 30 states that either have something like this or are moving towards that, which I really think it's a good thing. But there is one other thing needed, and that is it's one thing for me as a chancellor of IUEs to know that where money is coming from. But that doesn't change. That may change my culture, but that doesn't change culture of the faculty members. So what I did there, I took this equation to the schools. Remember, when a university gives a state appropriation, then university divides it to these schools. And typically it's either uniform, like we got 2%, everybody get 2%, or a president may be more influenced by the dean of College of Nursing, and here's more money. But that doesn't, again, create that culture. I wanted every faculty, every dean, every department chair know This is what state wants, degrees. So we said your state appropriation is going to be measured by degree completion from that school. We look at business school, how many degrees, we give them dollar figures, much like what this equation says. As soon as we did that, about 4 years ago, unbelievable discussion took place when I was sitting through the meetings. They're talking about state equations. They know state equations. And that's how a culture could be affected in this particular case. I am hopeful that the conference committee will consider, I don't know the details of your performance-based funding that is being discussed, but I hope that that will be implemented for universities in Texas. This may be a good place for me to stop and see if you have any questions.
I got one.
Members, Jerry?
As you've seen this performance-based funding progress, have you been able to at least subjectively qualify quality, upholding the quality of your graduates, and so that the institutions aren't gaming to get people out in early to get more money, et cetera, et cetera? Could you comment on that?
That was if you remember, I said there are 6 factors that you have to have strategies, one of which is quality. You have to have a series of things, and those checks and balances would watch it. Increasing the assessment, having program review, not only for professional schools. Engineering is reviewed by ABAT for their programs, but university has established program review, regular review from outsiders to come and take a look at the programs that they're offering, and outcome-based assessment of the degree programs, checking with employers to make sure the students are, those are things that are built in so that we don't produce numbers just because we want money for it. But and I've also learned that as much as it's difficult to change faculty's culture in different universities, their commitment to quality is always there. Somehow they do feel that they've got to do the best, and they really want their students best. So that has not been an issue.
Harold?
Doctor, what brought this on in Indiana? Was it the cost? Was it, I mean, how did you move, or how did the state of Indiana rather move to get these things in place?
Well, ironically, kind of universities complain, not really asking for this, but kind of making a statement for the previous model. And that got people in the Commission for Higher Education think and move there. My theory, it's not a science for everyone to know exactly the day that this started, but remember, previous to 2005, our funding was based on enrollment change. So if your enrollment went up, you got some dollar figure extra for that. If it didn't, you didn't. So some of the major universities, the more stable universities, universities that they had maxed out in the numbers, their credit hours were kind of flat. So as a result, what happened was they didn't have much of an enrollment change. When you are teaching huge number of students year over year over year, you won't. And then smaller campuses, because they have potential for growth, they were getting funding and more and more and more and more. So that system by itself had some flaws, and that put some pressure that this is not going to work. We are not giving funds to areas to all campuses. So that started discussion. What do we do? What to do? This coincided with all these discussions about jobs and recession hit and that move there. I think what really made it work is that in the state of Indiana we have Commission for Higher Education, which has a responsibility of approving degree programs, looking at the budget, approving buildings, construction, etc., and recommendation for budget of the university to legislators. And year over year, there were recommendations. The legislators, would. Are we being taped here, by the way? which were wonderful legislators, and they would take the recommendations and they would look at many other factors and demands on their own and come up with something. And may not have been actually the recommendation of higher education. We have a commissioner, Teresa Lubbers, who used to be a senator and then became the commissioner for higher education, head of the commission. Because of her connection with the Senate, she knew exactly how to get these recommendations become reality, how to get it through the system. And the legislators, we started taking these very seriously. That gave more feeling to the commission that they could be creative, because now all that equation will not go to waste. They won't take a recommendation, throw it in trash, and then start another one. So it's been a gradual evolution in this. And as I said, if you ask presidents, most would be happy, some will not be. I could tell you this, they haven't finished the budgeting yet. We don't have the budget, but if today was the last day, the Senate budget that I looked at, there are 17 campuses in Indiana. My old campus, IU East, is going to receive about near 8% increase in state appropriation. There are 3 or 4 universities that will have a cut of 1% in their appropriation. So you could see that some would like it, some don't like it, but it all depends on how you have performed in this period.
Any further questions before we ask Phil to join Dr. Padar? Phil, I'm going to introduce you whether you like it or not. Phil Deavel, our own council member, is going to join Dr. Padar to talk in more depth about responsibility center management. Phil has got 26 years of higher ed experience. Most of it with the University of North Texas as their Vice President of Finance and Business Affairs, and concurrently Vice Chancellor for those same areas for the system. And most recently, he was called out of retirement in 2010 to serve a stint as the interim president for UNT.
That's his fault.
Thank you again. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Which Lee is forever in debt to you for. So with that, Phil, if you would join Dr. Padar and kick us off on this discussion regarding RCM.
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to stay here, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to introduce
Join
this
him in
subject.
spirit.
Yeah, I will. He knows I'm there.
Yes.
There was a cartoon many years ago, it was a BC cartoon, and I didn't consider it particularly funny, but I thought it was instructive. And it was BC and Thor sitting on a beach looking up at the stars at night, and BC asked Thor, will we ever understand the secrets of the universe? And BC said no. And Thor said, why? And BC said, because it ain't in the budget. And I thought about that, and I said, it's true. And when we start thinking about higher education, if it's not in the budget, you generally don't do it. It's something that faculty sometimes have a problem with, and academic administrators have a problem with. But when they sit down and they think about it for a second, say, well, you're right. If it's not in the budget, we're not going to do it. So budgeting is an extremely important aspect of what goes on in the university, because it really drives what we do. And so the budget is a very, very strong tool in driving behavior at an institution. And if you look at this list that was given to you about those institutions that are using RCM, Responsibility Center Budgeting, there's 40 such institutions on there. These aren't beta sites. They have actually implemented this. But you say, okay, they're using RCM. Now, 40 institutions, probably not 10% of all the campuses in our country. I don't know how many universities and colleges and community colleges there might be. So the question is, well, what are the rest of them using? And I'd also point out that there are none in the state of Texas on that list. So what is the state of Texas using, and what is the rest of the country using that are not on this list? And 95%, 98%, I'd venture 99% of them use the same approach, and that's incremental budgeting, which is you look at your budget for the prior year, you kind of look at your gross revenues you're going to be getting from the legislature, you're going to be looking at your tuition income, you're going to be looking at these things, you're going to say, Well, how much more money do I have or how much less money do I have? And then you incrementally change your college budgets, your department budgets, all your administrative unit budgets, and you make a small incremental change. Oh, you might move a faculty member from this discipline to that discipline, whatever, but you're just nibbling around the edges. You're really not changing behavior materially. This is an issue that these institutions have addressed. So how can we materially change the way we do business on our campuses to truly effect change and change the culture on our campuses? So in 2005, the president of the University of North Texas at that time, Norval Pole, he started put together a group to explore RCM at the University of North Texas. I chaired that effort, and it was a very, very large group, and it represented the entire university community. Every college was represented, every administrative unit, every auxiliary unit were represented on that committee. And we had gotten pretty deep into it until Norval Pole resigned, and new president came in and said, I'm not going to have any part of that. Says, I've got other fish to fry. There are other things that I want to do, and we're not going to move forward with RCM. So we dropped the effort. And that was certainly the prerogative of the president at that time. But regardless, during this period of time of reviewing RCM, I got to understand it pretty well. And I gained an appreciation of how it could truly drive change on a university campus. We have so many words are thrown out all the time about all these different efforts that go on at campuses around the country that are trying to drive change, and quite frankly, they don't do a lot. They might do it in one particular area, but they don't address the whole campus and affect change on the whole campus, like I saw that RCM did. Now, why is that? Well, under incremental budgeting, you've got your top administrators, your president, your CFOs, your provosts. They are looking at the revenues that are coming in, and then they are deciding how much the expenditure budgets can be on campus. The critical difference between incremental budgeting and RCM is that on a university campus, and every one of them in the state of Texas, all of the discussions in all your academic units and nearly all your administrative units, except at the very highest level, the president and the provost, are on expenditures. Revenues are truly not discussed. All they want to know is how much money are you going to give me? I'm going to lobby you, Mr. President, Mrs. President. How much money are you going to give me so that I can do my business the way I've been doing it for umpteen years? Under RCM, that changes dramatically. All of a sudden, you are telling the dean or the department chair, you're not only going to be talking about expenditures, you're going to be talking about the revenues that you are generating within your college or within your department, and you are going to have to live with those revenues. Now, it's not an absolute. There is room to move that bar. But all of a sudden, the discussion changes. And as Nasser was talking about, he moved that discussion from the top level administration and moved it down to the college level and to the department level, to where now all of a sudden they were concerned about their degrees that they were generating, because that affected the funding at the college level, at the department level. A dramatic change that does not exist in the state of Texas. That does not exist. And until that exists, you will not see any material change in the culture of what goes on in the state of Texas. Now, when I was going through this process, and I want to tell you just a little bit about it, it was rather dramatic, the different attitudes that existed on our campus. Because for some times we had been generating reports which showed how much each college generated in tuition and other fee income. And those colleges that were doing quite well and were exceeding their expenditures, boy, they couldn't wait for RCM to come on our campus. But those that were in trouble, College of Music, College of Engineering, College of Business, believe it or not, they're saying, this isn't so good. I'm pretty good at lobbying my president to keep this money coming to me, and I don't want to have to increase the course load of my faculty. I don't have to listen to the whining and all that other stuff. I kind of like the way things are. So, of course, you had the winners and losers. The winners, like your College of Education, saying, hey, bring it on. Let me tell you, we know how to do this, and we've been doing it. We've been doing a great job, and we can grow our college. So, and then you had your researchers. The researchers on campus all of a sudden saw that they were going to be treated differently. They were going to get a much larger return on indirect cost recovery, and they said, man, can I build my research effort now? But, of course, the research office, which was taking most of that, said, it's not such a good idea. Why do we want to give it to you? I've got all this staff that I want to continue to fund in my research office. I don't want to give it to you. I've got these other priorities. And, they had arguments. But when you weighed the two, the argument of the researcher was much stronger than that of the research office. You had your auxiliary units like housing and dining services. I don't understand what the problem is. We've been under RCM all our life because we don't get any state appropriations. We've always had to live within our revenues. And when I talk about auxiliary units, I'm talking about like housing and dining services. No state funds went to them. So they're saying, we're fine with it. The support units, like the ones I was over, they're getting a little antsy because the way they get funded is to basically tax the academic units, to pay for the services that my group was providing. But since I was chairing this effort, I didn't have anything to argue with them about, And then more interesting were the perhaps the president and the chancellor. Now, I'm not talking about any chancellor present here today, and I'm not talking about any president that might be here today. But there's a power issue that was kind of in this a little bit. And that is that all of a sudden, the president that had all this authority over every piece of revenue that came in saw some of that authority going down to the deans or down to the department chairs. And they said, well, I don't know about this. I kind of like being the big dog and being able to control every nickel that's allocated out on a annual basis. And I want to be able to keep control over this. So there was a little bit of an issue there, but I don't think that was the driving point. The other key thing that these units saw was that, and one of the strengths of RCM is that unexpended revenues could be kept in those units and used to enhance their programs in the subsequent years. Now, obviously, we all know general revenue doesn't carry forward from one year to the next, but board-designated tuition does, and now that's a bigger dog than state-mandated tuition is. So there are all these incentives that were all of a sudden being created at the college level, and they all started understanding it. So really, that's all I wanted to say. I wanted to kind of introduce the subject, and I hope I didn't mess up what you're going to say.
No,
I know
didn't.
RCM is implemented differently on campuses, but I wanted to at least give you my perspective of RCM and why I'm hopeful that we have a good discussion here. So, Nasser?
Well, thank you very much, Phil. Much like what Phil said, maybe I should begin by giving an example. I've been with IU, Indiana University, for 28 years. When I became chancellor of IU East, one of the campuses in Richmond, Indiana, 5-6 years ago, every meeting I went to, the dean of science, I remember, was saying, can we have this, can we have that? And then I asked him, this was like July 2nd or 3rd. I asked him, what's your enrollment this fall? He says, I don't know, but I could ask registrar. Then you go to another meeting, someone else wants this money, as much, just like what Phil mentioned. And that is when I realized that we, myself included in universities, we are very much expenditure-oriented. We want money. We want things to do. And that what we needed to do is to get that culture change and make sure that people not only are aware of expenditure, but also income. Where's the money going to come from for that expenditure? So I started a discussion. I said, let's move towards RCM. Now, in universities, discussion about money is a very difficult one. For example, if I, as a chancellor, walk into a dean's office and say, I give you 100,000, she will say, what am I going to do with 100,000? We have a lot of expenses. What's 100,000? Now, if I go back and say, well, I'm going to have to cut 100,000, she will say, you might as well close this school. This is how things are. Money discussion is difficult to have in universities. So I propose this. Now, I hope you're not looking at that presentation. I'll tell you when to look at that presentation. But basically, defining RCM is like this. Today, the conventional, traditional way of dividing, I am the, let me use your language, president of a university. All the tuition comes to my office. All the state appropriation comes to my office. All indirect cost comes to my office. And every spring, I sit there and have budget hearing, and you as a dean of education come and tell me, I want to do this, I want to do that, can I have one of these, 3 of those, 4 of that? Okay, next dean, and at the end of it, we use some kind of a logic, president gives money, and we move on. It's not as casual as I said, but it's not that different from that either. Money is distributed. They take it and they have this discussion with their department chairs. Next year, this is your budget. You had this much. I'll give you this much. And that's the way it works. So deans are in the position of begging for things, and president is in a position of giving things and deciding what the future of a program in a department be, right? By giving the money, indirectly you are allowing them to do it or not allowing them to do it. And chancellors, presidents don't know the details of it. And that's the way the traditional way is. RCM is completely reversed. Meaning, at the beginning of fiscal year, deans predict what their credit hours is going to be in this coming year. Based on the past, what their plans are, they say 10,000 credit hours, just a number. We know what the state appropriation is coming for us by May. We know all of that. So what we do is we divide tuition and state appropriation based on a predetermined equation to schools. So we say, this is your tuition because you're going to teach that many. This is your $10 million. This is your state appropriation. Go construct your budget within. Then we go through a year. At the end of the year, if the school taught as many credit hours as they said they would, exactly, then that's fine. They said they will. We give them the money. They spent it. We are happy. If they went below it, then they owe the university some money. So you say, I want to teach 10,000 credits, but you taught 9,000. You've got to return that back to us. But if you taught 20,000, you get to keep your money. So you could become entrepreneur and you could spend the money. Remember, at the beginning of fiscal year, we divide tuition, state appropriation to the schools, and only schools. So what pays for president's office? We tax the schools for the use of money for president. We tax schools for registrar. We tax schools for admissions office. So what happens, they get to see how much money they're paying president's office, registrar's office, library, and everyone's coefficient is different. If you are a school that has a lot of students, you pay more to admissions office than a school that has very little student, because admission office must have done more to bring more students there. So you give the money to schools, you tax them for the rest of the operation, you go through the year, and then you sit down and see where you are. If there is any begging, the begging comes from the president's office. I had to go and tell my deans, I need to add 1 more vice president next year. We need that. We have grown. We need this. And it's going to cost you this much, this much, this much. And I had to justify it. Why am I doing this? See, the tables are turned. Instead of deans telling me, I'm telling them we want to increase study abroad. Everyone's cost is going to go up this much. So this way, tables are turned. They are entrepreneurs. They could do whatever they want to do, and they will use the money wisely. Let me tell you this. After year of discussion, I had to educate everyone just to make sure that no one is thinking that here is the president trying to pull a fast one. When we divided, a month later, I got an email from a dean of liberal arts saying, Nasser, we've always sent these 50 people to Spain in this course and went on how wonderful this is. I mean, a long email. I said, so-and-so, I think you forgot. Remember, in the RCM model, I have no money. I've given every penny I had. You have huge amount of money now that you didn't have because of these things. He wrote back, on second thought, I could spend this money on something else. Because when they're spending, it's their money, they pay more attention than when it's president's money. So they paid attention to their laboratories, to the way they use money, to the programs. I was able to create partnership with so many community colleges in Indiana and Ohio, and have School of Nursing drive about 1 hour to go to state of Ohio in a hospital, offer RN to BSN, something that they would have never done. Because if they could teach like on the second floor versus driving, going back and forth, they would have never done it. But that meant so much money for them, more positions, more whatever they want to do. They were willing to do that. We had partnership with community college. We offer in Cincinnati, neighborhood of Cincinnati, Lawrenceburg, 5 or 6 baccalaureate degrees, 3rd and 4th year, in buildings of community colleges, and people are willing to go 2 hours, drive, go, come, go, because it's their operation, it's their baby. They own their school. I must say, I was not able to convince any other chancellor to come along for the very same reason that Phil was mentioned, power. But true power is developing a vision, identifying what you want to do, how faculty could play in there, empowering them, and watch them do what you wanted done anyways. The day I left that campus, I had so much respect from every school. Even though we changed the budgeting system, I had no money to give them. But they were prosperous. They've increased their faculty enormously. The size of the university campus also grew by about 90%. Yes?
I have 2 questions. You say you left the campus. Did this process stay, Responsibility Center Management, RCM, did it stay in place?
I guarantee you it will be there forever. Once you give a piece of meat to a dean, there is no way you could go get it back.
Okay. And then you said you tax the money coming through. At what level, or is it different for different departments, or how does that work?
What we did was, at the end of the year, administration determined the new costs going forward. For example, we need to add 2 more people in admissions for some reason. Every unit called RC, Responsibility Center. At that campus, we had 6 academic RC and 10 non-academic RC. So we would figure out the cost of non-academics. So we want to give a raise to non-academics by 2%. That's going to be X amount of money. These monies, we will collect it, and it would come out to be, let's say, $10 million or $6 million. Then $6 million would be the additional tax going forward to these people, but it will be divided in a non-uniform way. So that some may go up by 4%, some may go up by 7%, because we agreed to certain equation before we implemented this.
So in the big aggregate, X dollars came in. Mm-hmm. How much, independent of what the formula was for different departments, how much was the tax?
Typically
20%?
some years, I did it there for about 3 years or so before I left. Some years we had about 5% tax, some years was 3% tax. So overall tax year over year was up in the order of 2 or 3%, which 1 or 2% of it went to the raises of the non-academic. Remember, they have no income. President doesn't make any money, right? So we had to get those raises for all the staff from that unit. We had, if there was a healthcare, of course, cost has been going up. Universities absorb parts of that and pass on parts of that going forward, these deltas. And so some of that increases came from the taxes that they pay.
Other questions?
But their income, because they were able to increase their credit hours in a dramatic way, tuition were increased in this period. State appropriation was almost flat in this 5 years or so that I was there. Their income went up by maybe 10-15%. And that's why they loved this system, because they took it. And there was this firewall between schools so that no administrator could say, well, I like this dean more than I like that dean, their money goes there. And one other thing that happened was this. I swear, in a course of a month, I got 3 calls that one of them said, Dean said, you know that we are the main reason that this university really existed in here. Another dean said, well, we are the major contributor to this place, because everyone is trying to tell you that they are the one. But when the decision is made based on equations, they didn't need to impress me. They didn't need to go behind their colleagues' back. They became friends. They started doing things together to increase income for each other. So that was another byproduct of the RCM. Someone had it.
And then
Yes.
Beth.
Nasser, may we call you Nasser?
Of course.
I'm the system head in the system in which Phil Diebel made his very effective but ultimately not prevailing arguments. And it's true, we've had
Right.
willing to lose the personal marginal revenue they could distribute. So in Indiana,
Nope.
our state's does to a pretty significant degree, and so you could argue that the college level or responsibility have a more dramatic effect.
Yes.
Take the example of music. We have a College of Music at our flagship in Denton that arguably has only one rival in the country, and that's at Indiana. The two of them think
Yes.
they're neck and neck, Indiana-Bloomington. But Indiana University is on this list of campuses that use
Yes.
a version of responsibility-centered
Yes.
management. So my argument has been that there must be ways to recognize a cross-subsidy and plan to it. If you
Yes.
have a program that literally won't be self-supporting because you charge all students the same tuition, you get the same, in your case, revenue from the state, your College of Music, with very, very small performance-based one-on-one tutorials, may not break even at the same rate that your College of Engineering may. But at least for planning purpose, you can say with 1,000 students, your subsidy is 57.2%, and next year's budget will be based on 57.2%. In other words, we're going to manage the subsidy, but it doesn't mean that every boat stands on its own.
Exactly. But there is, Lee, there is another, let me see if I could quickly come up with an answer.
If may I
Please.
throw my 2 cents in here? This came up during our discussion, as you can imagine. It did. And, there are 2 ways you address that. One, of course, is differential tuition. You can actually charge through board-designated tuition. I think the authority is there. I've been out of it a while, but to actually charge a different rate of tuition for, say, yeah, you can. I think you can.
Well, You could, Phil, but you're going to take those occupations which may produce the lowest average salary in the workplace in the creative arts and say they're more expensive, so we'll charge a lot more.
Well, I mean, I'm talking about, I say that is an option. The other option, at least through my reading of RCM, is that the president would maintain what they call a subvention fund. Basically, they would withhold, say, at the University of North Texas, $10 million will be held centrally. And that will be used to address programs just like the College of Music, so that the College of Education doesn't get every nickel that they earn, because every institution has got to recognize there are certain programs on their campus that are never going to be able to pay for themselves, but because of their quality, because of what they contribute to the academic process, you are going to maintain and you are going to fund. So under the president, they don't give it all out. They can hold a subvention fund that they can use to address that very issue. And we had a long, lengthy discussion about this very issue because the College of Music was represented, and Jim Scott would show up, who's our dean of our College of Music, and that's what we talked about that.
Well, don't get me wrong. Phil converted me. I believe in the concept. Both managing costs and managing revenues would be different. We don't allocate space costs to the departments in the colleges. So somebody says, I need that conference room down at that end of the hall, and it's assigned to them. If they don't use it, they don't pay any price for not using it. They're not charged on a per unit for their use of the IT system. There are a whole lot of central services that aren't charged out that could be and should be. And the revenue impact of actually watching enrollment, if we have a dip in semester credit hours in the middle after the fall semester, that doesn't translate back to any departments or colleges whose enrollment didn't meet target. That's the university's budget problem. There's no one sitting there saying, gosh, why did my departments produce so much less teaching than we had proposed and were budgeted for us? I think the net results can be very good, but it would require much stronger management of effective deans to make sure that decisions at the departmental level were being made wisely. Because, by the way, there's a 2008 Hanover Research Council study that I recommend to you. We might want to get copies of it for the members of the council.
I've got it here.
They looked at all the major research universities that have used it, and Michigan backed away from it because they found it was detracting from the university's ability to drive strategic goals, that it empowered deans to be fiefdoms. When they controlled all this revenue, they weren't necessarily democratic or wise in how they related to their departments, nor did they necessarily want to support the main strategic goals of the University of Michigan. They were more powerful fiefdoms than they had been before. So at least in some instances, it's something that doesn't automatically produce the marketplace result. It would take better, more proactive
If I could give this a try, Lee, let's assume we have a university that has only 3 colleges. The way you start at the first day, and this is what we had to do at IU East, we had 6 of them. So I'm trying to borrow a page from Ross Perot, who used to get a chart here. Or I should be very careful in Texas using that example. But so this is engineering, this is nursing, this is music. Let's say that this is the total, like the year before RCM. Today, engineering has an expenditure, right? Has a budget, $50 million right here. Today is what they need to operate. Nursing may need $30 million, and music may need $15 million. So the top of these bar charts is what that school needs today to operate. When you switch to RCM, you want to hold them harmless the first day. So you look at also what is engineering bringing in tuition-wise. Let's say shaded area is the tuition that they bring in today. So shaded area is the tuition that they bring in. This is their cost. Nursing tuition is very low. The cost is higher partly because they have these, at State of Indiana, they have 10-to-1 ratio clinical, and same thing here. So their tuition is much less than their cost. And music is even less than what their cost is. So in the first day, what we do is we fill the rest of these with the state appropriation that at that moment university is getting. So which means engineering gets much less than nursing, than music. So the point I'm trying to make, there is no one-to-one ratio between the dollar figure that we get from the state and the distribution to the schools. That's what we had to do, or we could not have kept them harmless when we switched to that. And then moving forward, then the state appropriation will go up and down based on what they already have, meaning that we are subsidizing music and nursing much more in Indiana than we do science. Science doesn't get much of state appropriation in the RCM part.
Did you hold harmless more than 1 year? In other words, was that a permanent floor?
The next year, we also make sure that their budget, this is not a theory, this is something that IU Bloomington has done for about 20 years, IU East has done for 6 years. We make sure that the equations are such that allows them equal, and there are twists. We do have differential tuition, by the way. We take some tuition down if they don't need it. We take some up if they need it. So there is a bit of it is mathematically, it's possible. And as I said, you go to any school in IU, music, engineering, and they would say that this system works and we won't give it away.
One question about private funding that comes in, philanthropy, and,
yes,
which also is extremely important to our public schools. How do you ration that? Can a dean just jolly well go out and get his money and stuff, or do you sort of manage it? And I know most fundraising, the advancement or whatever the euphemism is called for fundraisers now in the schools, their salaries are charged a percent or some type of percentage of the overall budget. So how did y'all address that?
Well, the fundraising, which we really depend on, and we are just finishing a $1.2 billion campaign.
I think I remember reading.
It's a combination. I mean, deans have the authority to raise funds. Not much happened in the fundraising arena when we switched, or with RCM or without RCM, and we can't do without the support of the community and the supporters that we have. And in some cases, university coordinates activities. In some cases, deans do. We have an IU Foundation with around $2 billion in its foundation. The university has, and it works very well. Deans are empowered to work with the community with their own. Some foundations, university would approach. Some we have these.
Right. So there's no
effect there,
and no tax.
No tax, no. We don't even mix those monies. Those monies, IU Foundation is outside the university, completely separate. Okay. We don't mix it.
Mr. Chairman, if I
on this point?
No.
All right. Charles has been waiting to ask a question, then I'll come back to you, Phil.
I want to talk about the expense control part of this, and I'll give you a story. I was head of a university system. I had campuses here in Texas, had campuses in 12 cities. I was getting a lot of complaints about course fees. I mean, when the tuition bills would go out, I'd get more complaints about course fees than I would about tuition increases. So I began thinking about that, looking at it a little bit, and I thought that maybe the deans and department chairs were not spending that money correctly. And I sent the system auditor out, and I said, just audit 3 or 4 things at every school, and then bring that back to me for my eyes only. And what I found is that those monies were in the dean's offices or in the department chair's offices, and they would send somebody, we'll say, on a conference someplace, and the guy would draw up the money before he went, let's say a couple $1,000. When I went looking for the expense receipts, they weren't there. The statute in Texas is pretty stiff on what you're supposed to do with course fees. You're supposed to use them for the courses. I found department chairs taking some of that money, which was excess, and using it for all kinds of things that had nothing to do with the class. So I started asking my CFOs, why is this occurring? I mean, why are you guys not checking this expense? And they said, well, I mean, we literally had anywhere from 1,500 different course fees to almost 3,000 at one of the larger schools. Sometimes they're little amounts of money. Maybe for the English department, English class, small amount of money. Can't afford the staff to take a look at those receipts, and so we just trust those folks. What I believe I learned was that people that were in academics were not real good about making sure that everything was done the right way when it came to expense reports. So I'm worried in this system whether or not, or how you go about controlling how that money is spent. I found we did away with course fees, and it was interesting what happened. It was a good thing.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, this because you are now empowering 6 schools with a lot of money, and they decide whether they want to hire faculty or do this or do that, that means that the checking process becomes even more important than prior. So I had a very close review of work of these behind the scene by our finance office to make sure that they haven't gone in the wrong direction, but they had to have a proposal. They had to not ask for money, but they had to tell us what they're doing with their funds going forward. So there were more dialogue between schools and administration on the expenditure than before. But it wasn't like, give me the money, but it was, what's your plan? What are you doing? How are you doing it? When they would say, we're going to hire 5 faculty, that's fine, but tell me what it is that you are going to be doing. So I think that they also felt that they owe me more explanation than they did before, because they realized the explanation is not going to hurt their bottom line.
Answering part of my question, but the part that got me, because I'm kind of a bean counter, is that how did they make sure that when the faculty members said, I'm going to do X, that they actually spent that money and accounted for that money? How did you do that? How did you make sure that that money was spent correctly and was accounted for correctly, so if you were ever audited by the state auditor or whatnot?
I mean, maybe we didn't go that deep, but we had auditors of our own, internal auditors that made sure that the report was working with that. But other than that, there wasn't anything
Nasser,
special.
maybe let me give this a shot since I was the CFO.
Bill, this we need to transition to the next panel, so
okay,
I'll give you the last word here.
All right. 2 things. One, control over expenditures would be the same under the current system or this system primarily, because you're going to have a central office making sure that a voucher coming through is in accordance with state statutes and whatever. So that should be controlled. I mean, we had to do it at the University of North Texas, and they have to do it all over the campus, all over the state. The other point I wanted to make, if I could, Mr. Chairman, was Lee had talked about space. That is under RCM, you pay for the space.
Yeah.
And that's key. And let me tell you, until you start paying for it, you're going to grab hold of every square inch you can on campus.
During our cost efficiency council that Ray served on and I served on 2-3 years ago, Guy Bailey said that was something they'd implemented at the University of Missouri and that they were looking at. I'm not sure if they ever did anything with it at Texas Tech under his tenure, but that idea has surfaced before. Yeah, exactly.
May I ask one? Oh, okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to know if you had any community college examples. I'm very interested in the model. We have we do an allocation model, but we're missing some pieces. Do you have community college examples, or do you know of a community college that's implemented this?
No.
Okay.
No. In state of Indiana, there aren't any community colleges that implement RCM.
Brenda, I can't think of a reason why it wouldn't work, though.
Yeah. No, I'm just thinking taxes and that kind of thing, but I kind of have it working in my head. I probably need your drawing. So.
Just one quick question. When you put this in, did you see over a period of a couple, 3 years that the tuition needed went down, or that other costs went down? so you could control the cost structure?
Right. Yes. What happened was that student body went up, state appropriation stayed flat, and tuition was inched up 1 or 2% every year. So as a result, the cost per FTE went down. I must also say that state of Indiana saw the growth of this campus and heard me talk a number of times, and Lumina Foundation also looked into what we were doing. And I believe that I must say they did not trust that there is they thought something fishy is happening there. So what they did was Lumina commissioned funded a group through the Chamber of Commerce of Indiana, the MGT group from Florida, to come and do a study of IU East. So if you Google IU East MGT report, you will see their review of what has happened and how the cost per FTE has dropped and how we have been able to bend the curve going forward. So all of the changes we made is in some of the changes, because they came after 2 years, is in MGT, and I will be happy to send it to Mary, who could send it to you, so that they show tables as to how things change in 2 or 3 years.
Dr. Padar, thank you. And we would very much like to see that bending of the curve data, if you'd share that with Mary.
We will send it to you.
Thank you for joining us and for your comments. A lot of great ideas.
It is my pleasure. I think that there is a great potential for moving towards the performance-based funding in Texas, and also RCM at the university. Lee is not here. He is looking for a president, I believe, University of North Texas, and I wish you the best in there, and I will be looking at what happens at that university.
We'll let him know that you're watching.
Thank you. Maybe more than watching.
Let me introduce our next panel on higher education accountability systems. And I think there's some, the biographies are in your materials. I don't know if there's any handouts, but we're going to start with our own Brenda Hellier, who's going to provide an overview of the voluntary framework of accountability that's being developed by the American Association of Community Colleges. Then following her overview, we will have representatives from some of our university systems, a distinguished panel, to talk to us about the systems of accountability that they are implementing to enhance university performance. And that will include, and y'all are welcome to come on up to the front table, of course, Renu Khator, who is Chancellor of the University of Houston System and President of the University of Houston. Renu, thank you for being with us today. James Hallmark, Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs with the Texas A&M University System, and with whom I've been in at least a couple of press conferences this session. And Elaine has as well, of course. Stephanie Bond, is it Huey? Stephanie is Vice Chancellor ad interim for we never have short titles in higher education. For the Office of Strategic Initiatives at the University of Texas System. Welcome, Stephanie. And my old friend Perry Moore, Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at Texas State University System. Perry, thank you also for being here. So if you will hold your questions, as difficult as it is, this means you too, Charles, and we'll let each of our distinguished presenters get through their portion of the deal, and then we'll, I'm sure, have a lot of questions. So, okay. Brenda, we'll start off with you.
Great. Thank you. When I was asked to speak, it was about the voluntary framework of accountability, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background on accountability for Texas community colleges. And first of all, we have accountability at our individual colleges. I mean, if you talk to any of us, we are looking at a variety of measures, and I'm going to go over those, but I really want to focus on state and national today. And on the individual colleges, I just gave some examples. Multiple layers, the student success measures we're looking at. There's about 30 community colleges in Texas involved in achieving the dream. We've been looking at retention, persistence, degrees, a variety of measures that we're looking at from cohort tracking over multiple years. We look at our feeder high schools for penetration rates. We do reports on how those high school feeders are coming into us with GPAs, the developmental education, a bunch of different metrics in those areas. We also look at our external exams and certificates, what our pass rates on the NCLEX or fire protection, a variety of pieces. and then program review. And we do program review, at least at my institution, on a rotating 4-year basis in every program. If it's English is getting reviewed, fire protection, nursing, and it's across our entire college system that we're going through on that. And that really does feed into budget recommendations, efficiency recommendations. And then we have operational measures also that we're looking at. And I think if you talk to any of the community colleges, you would find a variety of these measures that we're looking at. At a state perspective, there are 50 community college districts, and we really work closely with the Texas Association of Community Colleges. And I think this legislative session, you will see that that partnership is much greater. We go to the legislation with one agenda, and some big projects we're working on is our new math pathways. And that is looking at math with the University of Texas Dana Center and really trying to create some new pathways from a statistical and from a STEM approach, and then also from looking at the quantitative piece of it. Again, all 50 community colleges are working on this project, and we're building a Texas Success Center. About 60% of the community colleges in Texas are rural. They don't have the resources necessarily to scale the way some of us larger colleges have, and so we're putting together resources so that we can help all the colleges in Texas make differences in these areas. And I think the biggest thing we've done is our Student Success Points model. And I put this up. It's probably hard for you to see, but you'll get this slide also. This is our performance funding model that we have gone to the state with, and this was developed in accordance with the coordinating board. Our funding model for this year will have some core operations. It'll have contact hour funding, but 10% of our funding recommendation is that we would go to student success points. And what's very unique about this model is it looks at the various milestones for the students that come to us. And so you can see if we get students through developmental math, we get a point. Developmental reading or writing is a half point each. Once they take their first college level course, there's points, and 15 hours, 20 hours, but ultimately degrees and certificates, and also a focus there with 2.25 points for STEM. There's other points in here that don't have the blue lines associated with them, adult basic education and GED or high demand. Those are areas we see in the future that need to be built into our performance funding. But this is a real focus for all 50 community colleges, looking at these areas and how we can make an impact on performance funding from these areas.
Brenda, just take a brief moment to interrupt and say that there's a key reason why this is in Senate Bill 1, and it's really due to the dynamic and cohesive leadership that TAC has put together. Richard Carpenter and Bill Holda and Richard Rose, and I'm sure other presidents like yourself who've reached out to members of the legislature and say, you know, not only is this based on consensus and collaboration, but we're ready and we want to take this step. And I just want to commend the leadership and the cultural change that y'all have accomplished within these 50 community college systems. And
thank you.
To get all those cats on one page must have been a pretty tasty bowl of milk, but it's working.
It's been a lot of great progress during the last 18 months to come up with this. And again, knowing that there's winners and losers in this, but in the end, we know we need to address these issues for our students. And so thank you for recognizing the work that's gone into it. On the national level, the American Association of Community Colleges represents the 1,132 community colleges throughout the country. And you have a report in your folder called Redesigning the American Dream, or Reclaiming the American Dream. It's this report. This was done by the Association of Community Colleges. It came out in 2012, and it was really put together as a challenge based on President Obama's goals for 2020 of increasing the college graduates by 5 million. And if you look at this report, it's a real challenge for community colleges across the country to really start doing some things differently. And the next step of this report has been that an implementation team has been put together, and there's about 120 leaders across the country working on how do you really take the recommendations in this report and implement them and roll them out to all community colleges across the country. There's quite a bit of representation on this committee from Texas. Ray Garcia from TAC is involved. We have Richard Carpenter from Lone Star. Tarrant County is involved. I'm involved. But again, it's looking at, we really do have to reinvent what we're doing. And so you see on the screen, redesign students' educational experiences, reinvent institutional rules, and reset the system to create incentives for student and institutional successes. And that's the work that's being done. And part of what came out of that, here's the report, part of what came out of that is the need for a voluntary framework of accountability. And this is a system that's being designed for community colleges by community colleges. We know the measures that are out there right now on a national level for community colleges don't measure what we do. iPads measure first time, full time in college. Well, I bet if you talk to Roberto or if you talk to me, about 70% of our students are part-time. That's what you see throughout community colleges. And so we took accountability very seriously, and we began designing a system. And if you have a handout that looks like this, and it shows what's being designed in this voluntary framework of accountability. And there's 3 components: student progress and outcomes, workforce, economic, and community development, and then student learning outcomes. And all 3 of those areas have been areas that we've had conversations with on this council. The student progress and outcomes piece, you can see the metrics that have been designed, but they're metrics that really do measure that unique mission of community colleges, from developmental education, the progress measures, and graduation. You'll see 6-year outcome measures, and I know we've had conversations about, is that time too long? Those are the measures that we've built into this. We are all focused on how do we get students to complete earlier, though. The workforce and economic and community development features will focus on the workforce pieces and also the adult basic education. That part has not been designed yet. And then the student learning outcomes are the next component. Right now, the student progress and outcomes, they were developed by 60 community colleges. We've increased the information network to about 120 community colleges, and we're rolling out beta testing starting in May to 70 colleges. I guess it's 80 colleges now, so they can start figuring out how can we gather this data across the nation and make this the accountability system for community colleges across the country. Arizona and Nebraska have incorporated this into their performance funding. Pennsylvania has officially adopted the VFA. California has just come out with a new scorecard. They've aligned it with the VFA. And then the student academic measures, SAM, that are being developed will also use VFA as the basis for their measures. And I look at the performance funding that the student success points that have been put together for community colleges in Texas. And while the calculations aren't exactly the same, we used the philosophy that was in the VFA so that once we roll this out, we can use what we're doing in Texas for our student success points and align it with these measures. There's a lot of work that's been done around this. As we continue to work on the workforce piece of it and the student learning outcomes, I think we do have to monitor what's going on at this federal level. I think we also need to probably push more of us to be involved at that federal level so that we're designing metrics that really do work with us. Texas is a lead with the kind of data that we have. And so how do we continue to help that mold into this model, which will let us really see how community colleges in Texas are doing with those across the country. And so I see this being a broader vision for accountability. You're going to hear from the universities on their individual accountability models. And I do hope that at one of our next sessions, we could have specific community colleges come in and talk about how they're monitoring efficiency, how they're bringing those other pieces into it also, because I think that's an important piece to see that these measures really do tie into how we're operating our institutions.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.
Presentation and some good homework. I would encourage everyone to read through the report and the VFA.
I'll be sending you questions on these, so just you be ready.
There'll be a quiz at our next meeting. Well, let's transition to our panel with our distinguished university representatives. And so we'll go from our right to our left, starting with Dr. Couture. Well, apparently, we may.
I think
will the PowerPoint sequence dictate the sequence here? Okay.
That was fairly easy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to just discuss briefly about the University of Houston and the accountability, and I would parcel out the presentation in two different ways, the external accountability and the internal accountability. So I'm in my 6th year now. I started in 2008, January of 2008. And I wanted just to first to give you as to the progression of the university. So here is in where we were in 2008, and eventually during my presentation I'll refer to two documents, and if I can just request you to just pull them out from your package here. One of them looks like a booklet, this red color, and the other one is a one sheet, but it says University of Houston funding model. So those are the two documents I'll refer to. In 2008, there were several of these things with the universities. You can say that for Carnegie classification, we were nowhere there. We were actually in Tier 2, listed there. For Top American Research University, which is known as a TARU, which is a national benchmark data mark, we were not at all in TARU designation. We used to be at some point in time, but we had lost that designation. In other words, we were not recognized as a national research university. There are 9 TARU measures. We had only one. Finally, in 2008, in the top 50 in the nation, we were not anywhere in Princeton Review. We were not anywhere in U.S. News and Best Colleges, and we were not anywhere in terms of the best graduate schools where we are today. We had only 4 programs in the top 50. Now we've moved forward, and in 2013. We are designated by Carnegie classification as their very high research university, or Tier 1. We are also listed in the Top American Research University, top 50 public research universities. We have 3 measures last year. This year, when the new report comes out, we have 5 measures in the top 50. We are in Princeton Reviews as a best college. We are ranked in U.S. News and World Report. We have 11 instead of 4 programs in the top 50. Those are graduate programs. We made the criterion for National Research University Fund. We are also ranked number 17th among publics for IP revenue. Let me just illustrate that point. In 2008, when I came, our annual revenue from faculty's technology transfer was $600,000 per year. This year, we finished in 12, and this continuing year is going to be $17 million. So there have been many measures like this, and I'm not even pointing out some other national classification. You can practically look at any national list with other than AAU. We just sit almost on every national list, and we were nowhere before. We are also number 12th ranked in the nation in affordability index in graduating students with the least amount of debt at the time of graduation. We are the greenest university. Having done all of this, taking budget cuts is still based on the faculty staff survey within the university. We are ranked by Chronicle of Higher Education among the best universities and colleges to work for. We are the highest ranking in the state of Texas in terms of community engaged university, received an award from President Obama's Honor Roll Council. And we have also received a lot of attention now from the community and alumni, which I say is indicative from the way they open their wallets and pocketbooks. We were getting about $39 million per year in fundraising. Last year, we raised $112 million. So all of these 5 years are really based on 2 things. First of all, the ingredients were already there. The talent was there. It was just not synchronized. And secondly, because I do believe very strongly in rankings and benchmarks and in measurements. 2 days ago in San Francisco, I spoke at the Association of Governing Boards, where there were 1,200 members, participants, mostly the board members from all over the nation. And I gave my presentation on accountability, and that's what I told them. And I said, I'm saying that I believe in these things without any of my board members being in the audience, which means I really do believe in it. And then I measured in the next 24 hours, I had 1,000 hits on our the page that I'm going to show you some things from right now. So how this has been possible, and I'm just going to give you a glimpse of it. External accountability, first of all. It is very important that we measure, we have benchmarks and we measure. And it's important for two reasons. And I have discussion all the time and arguments with my faculty colleagues who simply don't like to be bound by measurements. The reason I believe in it is, number one, it keeps us focused. And that's how the University of Houston has moved forward. And secondly, because it starts the conversation at the right point. I believe in it. I never finish the conversation with just the benchmarks, but I always start the conversations. Let's look at the numbers. And now if you have any other story to tell me, tell me. First, I want to see the numbers. So we developed what we call progress cards. They were developed in first 5 months of my being there because I realized if I have honeymoon period, I might as well use it for one very important thing. And this to me was the most important thing. So this is our progress card. This is what it looks like. You can you can see it in this booklet. And what you will find it's only one-page progress card. There is one card. It's on page number 7. That is for University of Houston system. It's not 100 items. It's very few items. And very critical ones is student success. You can see national competitiveness, community advancement, and competitive resources. And you can see it from the base year, which is 2007-2008. Then you can see it for last year, which was 2011 and 12. And you can see the next year following that. And the very end, you can see increase and decrease from the base year, which means 5 years, versus from last year. Red cells will tell you that improvement has been made. Red will tell you that it has been declined. Green will tell you the progress has been made. If you ever get into the debate with the academics about the definitions of measures, all the definitions are on the back page of the same progress card. So it's a one sheet. The next page is about the 4 campuses then, the University of Houston. That's the one sheet. And their definitions are, again, totally on the back, every single one, so we have no debate about it. How do you measure it, if it's the right way to measure it? Then you have University of Houston Clear Lake, again, one page, and same thing is with downtown, and same thing is with Victoria. So each year we present these to the boards. The presidents have to get up and explain their performance, their evaluation is dependent on it. So then the question comes, how do we select these measurements? Because sometimes campuses can spend 4 years, just debating about each of the measurements. Now, we had several, so these are the 6 areas of performance. Nationally Competitive Research University, of course, we take a look at all of those benchmarks that are moving us toward any kind of national competitiveness. Student success, very important for us. Community advancement, we just simply say, don't tell us what is it that you do in the community, you serve on board or whatever. We want to know what the impact is. Athletic competitiveness, national and local recognition was important to us simply because one of the problems with the University of Houston we felt was that our product was a lot better, the substance was ahead of its reputation. So we figured that we really needed to put some fire under those people who have to go out and sell the university and talk about it. And then competitive resources, fundraising, alumni participation, and so on. What we do is there's clear definitions, but all of those definitions, we have put the national measures whenever possible. So if there is a definition, a benchmark where there's a national definition available, we do not go to any other set of definition, local, institutional, state. Why? Because after all, we think we have to really stand tall in the national level and look to see how we are performing. So we don't get into the definitional arguments at all. There's a one definition. If that's the national, if that's the NSF funding, we'll just take it from there. Then we have not only that we stopped here at the university level, every single of my vice president has a divisional progress card, so I can see in just one very quick look as to how they are moving the measures within their division. Every single college has their progress card. The performance on the progress card is what is related to the dean's evaluation. Now, if I can just quickly draw your attention to internal accountability. We've talked a lot about outcome-based funding model, and we have one outcome-based funding model, and I'd like to present that to you. It is not punitive. It is not redistributive. It does not get into the discussion of who are the winners, who are the losers, because the idea is not to redistribute the money. To me, the idea was, how do I get all of these 13 horses, all my 13 colleges, plus these other divisions, the vice presidential areas in the university, to do their best, but also to move in one direction. So put your 100%, but move in one direction. And I always give one analogy. I said, you can try to put a couple who doesn't know at all about canoeing, put them in the river on a canoe and just watch it and just tell them this is how you go. I guarantee you for next half an hour, what you will find out is what their relationship is, because they'll yell at one another, why you're not doing this, why you're not doing this. And I can also guarantee that they'll be sweating because they are working 100% and the canoe is not moving anywhere. And after about half an hour or so, they figure it out what the rhythm is. And after that, they are putting 60% of their effort, and the canoe is moving beautifully. And I have done it several times, because anybody who visits me from India, they have never been on a canoe, and it's a beautiful experience to watch. So what the objective here was to put all of these horses, all of the colleges simply moving in the direction, and the direction is where the university wants to go, not where they want to go. So for us, we have the measures, and we've narrowed them down to two specific goals. And those two goals, and so here are some of the assumptions, and then I come to the goal. First of all, assumption is every college must contribute toward the twin goals of the university. Student success, you saw the benchmarks there earlier, and national competitiveness, those are the tier 1 benchmarks. I don't buy this at all, that we are the law school, we can't do this, or I'm the honors college, I can't do this. Every college can contribute toward these two goals. As a matter of fact, in this year's budget process, every single unit, even if it's a custodial unit, or these are the landscapers, everybody has to provide first a narrative before presenting their budget. How is it that whatever they do affects our student success and affects our tier 1 mission? Because if you can put it in words, I just don't think you're focused on it. Second thing is, every college we believe is distinctive, and it must build on its own strength. Our law center is very different than engineering, which is very different than College of Arts and Sciences, which is very different from School of Social Work. However, every college must contribute something toward these goals. And finally, I also believe that not every college can improve every measure every year, because some of the measures you invest in, it takes few years before you can see the impact. However, if you are strategic and smart enough, you should be able to show me improvement every single year. So based on that, we put our model, which is there are total 10 core measures, as you can see, and they are related to student success and national competitiveness. Every college must select 8 out of these 10. And then you can add some more, and that gives you your distinct profile. This is how you can say that I'm a graduate program and I do all graduates, because you will not select any undergraduate measures. The undergraduate programs like Honors College will select undergraduate measures first, won't select anything in sciences because that's not what they do. But I believe everybody can do that. And then you can add some more. And then we are basically asking them to show their performance on majority of the measures every single year. So they get focused, they stay focused, they don't complain about it, that they are so different that you can't really use the same measures on us. They know that they can provide their own strengths, but we hold the 10% of their budget, and they can get that 10% budget released only after they are showing their improvement on those majority of the measures. If they don't show the measures, the money will remain in the central pool, and we'll use it for other kinds of initiatives. So I think in the end, what I would like to just simply close by saying that, do I have resistance on campus? Yes. Do I get argument from the faculty? Absolutely. Do I get some disgruntled emails and some really good threats? Absolutely. All of that is necessary. But I can tell you at the bottom of it all, I do believe that there are always 10% of the faculty who want to take the university to the places where they have the dream for their own work. And when I ask the faculty, how are you? I mean, how do you put yourself in the context of the rest of the discipline? Every single one says, oh, I'm the best. I mean, I'm excellent. I'm tier 1. Then I ask them, I say, how is it possible individually you all can be tier 1 and together we're not tier 1? I say, it's not possible. So whenever they have questions, I always tell them, and I know who are those 10% faculty who really want to fly, want change, they want things different. And then there are 10% faculty who are so comfortable in their zone, they don't want to move at all. And then there are 80% in the middle who will move wherever the wind is shifting. So my whole effort in all of these 5 years has been, how do I take the empowerment from the bottom 10% who are very comfortable to those top 10% who are hungry, eager, and always restless. And slowly I know the ship has moved in that direction, and when we try to put it that way, even the faculty senate, I can tell you, they 100% support all of this. They come to defend me when I get disgruntled faculty. The student government, the board is totally on board. And we just feel that through these benchmarks, through these accountability things, I've given you only 2. We have a couple of others that we use that we really feel that we are moving the needle. Thank you very much.
Renu, thank you. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
You
Charles,
can applaud,
good
but
to see you.
continue to make notes and hold your questions to the end. By the way, that 80-20 rule is very much a lean principle, so I commend you on focusing on the change agents and not what we call the boat anchors in our environment. James, I think you're up next.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here. James Hallmark, Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs with the Texas A&M University System. Chancellor Sharp was unable to be here, and so I'm pinch hitting. But hopefully I'll be able to shed some light on some of the different things we've been working on within the A&M system. I have a little bit of hesitation because so much of what we're working on is generated by one of your members, Elaine Mendoza. And in fact, the current version of what you see is to a great extent, from my estimation, efforts that were born out of what I would say a July 2011 gathering, where Regent Mendoza, as chair of the Committee on Academic and Student Affairs, pulled together the presidents and of the universities and had them present some very basic information about their institutions. And she asked, and other members of the committee asked some very basic information. I was a provost at the time sitting in the back of the room, and I don't know what she thought about that meeting, but I thought, this is terrible. I thought our president should know more of this kind of information than they did. And it was fairly basic information, such as how many of you are graduating, your persistence rates, the graduation rates, those kinds of things. All of those bits of information are certainly studied at every one of our universities and colleges in the state of Texas. Community college, four-year school, it doesn't matter what system you're in. Those are all studied. But what we have done, largely through Regent Mendoza's leadership, is raise the visibility of those issues dramatically, such that now, almost 2 years later, if you asked any president in the A&M system what their freshman first year to second year retention rate is, they could tell you off the top of their head. They could tell you the 4-year and 6-year graduation rates. They could tell you what their cost per student expenditures are. And so what has really happened, I would say, over the past 2 years is taken the visibility of the accountability systems, taken it forward tremendously. As is true for all of us, I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap in what's being done across the different institutions and across the different systems, and I'm going to just highlight a few items for you. And certainly, because I come to this from the academic affairs side of the house, I will be heavily influenced on by the academic affairs accountability measures. There's certainly many other things that we're doing, as all these institutions are, that are not represented today. First place I want to start is with metrics and analytics. Then I want to say a few things about student learning outcomes, some of our P20 initiatives, faculty recruitment, retention, advising, access, acceptance, advancement, student affairs, operational efficiencies, and I was told I have 8 minutes. So I'll only be hitting a few things here or there. In terms of the metrics, analytics, it was stated earlier that Texas is really a leader in data, and that is correct. When you start looking at the national conversation, Texas and Tennessee seem to be the 2 states that are ahead of everybody else in the country in terms of having the data. I'd say what we're no better than anybody else on is using the data to make decisions. And I think that's something that all of the universities and systems, community colleges have done better in the last couple of years is taking that data and saying, how are we going to use this to drive decisions? And that's the analytics side of this. Metrics is just measuring stuff. Analytics is using that information to drive decisions. In terms of our analytics project, we have all the standard measures. I've got them listed in front of you there. There are certainly others that we could list, but it's the standard things that we all look at. One of the things that we've done that I think is a little different than some others is that all of these have what we call stretch goals. For enrollment, for graduate and high need areas, graduation rates. Each institution has identified a stretch goal in each of these categories that was shared with me. I negotiated with them in some cases. In some cases, I said that looks good. For example, there might be an instance where a institution turned in a stretch goal for research expenditures that I looked at that and thought there is no way that campus is going to reach that by 2015 or 2020. And so I called the president and said, okay, let's talk about this. And we rethought it. In other instances, we literally had institutions that turned in stretch goals for persistence rates that they had already reached. That's hardly a stretch to set a goal out there that you had already reached. So that we have that iterative process, but really those stretch goals come from the campuses, and they are identifying where they want to be in these different metrics by 2015 and by 2020. And I think that's a key component. A second component that I want to mention is that all of these are tied to peer and aspirational institutions. Many of these are identified through the coordinating board's process of identifying peer institutions, but many are not, where institutions have said, yes, these are the schools that are like us, but in addition, here's some schools that are what we want to be, and that's where we call in the aspirational institutions. And our stretch goals are all tied to what our aspirational institutions, and in some cases our peer institutions, are already doing. I think that's an important component of what we do in our analytics project. So we have these standard measures. We're also looking at what I think are more advanced measures, such as remediation, success in remediation, not just in the same class but in subsequent classes, how well those students are as they move forward. Timely progression metrics, I think that's very important as we talk about 4- and 6-year graduation rates. You can't assess that on a 4- and 6-year basis. You've got to be tracking that annually in order to have any idea as to whether you're really making the progress necessary. High impact practices, one of the things that all of our faculty and administrators on the academic side and student affairs side would say is that what really makes a huge difference is that engaged student. Well, we need to be tracking that and seeing it, first of all, if that data really points to that, and if so, what interventions we can implement in order to assure that our students are engaged. Another piece of the puzzle that we added was what we're calling excellence measures. Each campus identified areas that they specifically wanted to focus on. And these are not this is not earth-shattering stuff here, but it is a specific focus that campus has said, here's something that we want to do in addition to the general measures that we're doing all across the A&M system. We started talking about student learning outcomes, and honestly, many told us we couldn't do that. Faculty told us that. We had some administrators told us that. We had legislators say, that can't be done. But fortunately, we also had a large number of faculty and administrators within the A&M system who said, sure, we can do this. And we had others among that group who said, not only can we do that, but we have done that in other locations. And Regent Mendoza appointed 2 people to lead that project, one a president at West Texas A&M University who had already been through this process at a private school, Loyola University in New Orleans, and another, Chris Markwood, a provost at Corpus Christi, who had been through this process with the University of Wisconsin system, where he'd been a provost at one of those universities. And they led us through a process that has come up with these 6 student learning outcomes. If you look at this and compare it to, say, the LEAP initiative, you'll find that this is not terribly different from what the national conversation is, not that it should be. Where I think it is important is that we are moving forward on accountability is that we haven't just identified these and say this is something we're working on. Each campus is measuring these on a systematic annual basis for progress and is being held accountable for progress toward achievement of these learning outcomes, such that if their students have not made the progress, again, stretch goals, those kinds of things, progress one would expect in critical thinking skills, then we're not flunking the students, it's not that model, but rather we're taking that back, looking at the curriculum and saying, what changes do we need to be making in our curriculum to assure that we are improving the way we believe we should in critical thinking, in globalization, cultural diversity, et cetera. And I believe this is Very important initiative in terms of accountability. It's not just graduating students, but it's assuring that those students are leaving us with the kinds of life skills, if you will, that our industry needs, our culture needs, and that's something we're working very strongly on. We have a P20 initiative that deals with the public education, and I'm not going to go through each of these, but these are the 7 areas that they are focused on. Each one of these 7 areas have specific measures and metrics by which we will determine if we are making progress on our successful end. It's not just we need to rethink educator preparation. Well, of course we do. Okay? But the committees and task forces and working groups have identified specific outcomes, specific measures by which we'll determine whether we've achieved those outcomes, and specific timelines. And actually we've accomplished that for, I think, 4 of them at this point. We're still working. It's a work in progress. But the point is that all of these are specific outcome-driven measures. We are also looking at the faculty recruitment retention area. And the 4 areas that we're looking at right now is making sure that we have those outstanding faculty that we've recruited, the annual evaluation process, which is central to all aspects of assuring that we have outstanding faculty in our universities, of course, the tenure process and the post-tenure review processes. We don't have stretch goals and metrics associated with this yet, but that is something we're working on. In fact, Regent Mendoza and I were in an hour-and-a-half long conference call yesterday regarding this slide right here and some of the progress we're making and how to achieve that. The end goal, though, is to assure that every institution has a very systematic means of assuring this is being done well. And that is part of the whole accountability process. We've also stuck our toe in advising, and that was partially driven by anecdotes that we hear about how good and bad advising might be, but also by the coordinating board's report on advising that was probably about a year ago or so. And we've gone through this to assure that there is good assessment in the advising process at all of our institutions. What we found is that we do have good assessment of the professional advising. We do not have good assessment of the faculty-led advising. And most of the assessment we have in general is student satisfaction measures. And as all of us probably know, that satisfaction is an important variable, but not the only variable we should be considering. A student might be very satisfied with bad advice. And so we want to make sure that they are getting good advice, good counsel, and that's part of what this group is doing, as well as other things as noted on there. Student Affairs has been active as well, the other education, and they also are working on these specific areas to hold ourselves accountable to assure that our students have a good learning experience in the student affairs side. And we've also dove into the access, acceptance, and advancement, which is, if you will, recruiting and diversity side of things. And this initiative has just begun, and so we don't have as much data and analysis on this as we might like, but a good starting point is this model where we're thinking through, okay, what is the funnel and how do we impact that, and what are the metrics associated with assuring that each level of this funnel is being done well so that we can assure our campuses are reaching out as appropriately. And then there's various operational efficiencies. We've received considerable attention regarding outsourcing. That is a significant efficiency measure. There's a good bit of process analyses going on. I don't know if how many of you are aware of the Lean or the Six Sigma process, but that is one that looks very carefully at processes, or two strategies that look very carefully at processes to assure that it is the most efficient means of doing things. We're not just doing it because it's the way we've always done it. And that's an outstanding process for doing so. And then more on the academic side of the house in terms of the operational efficiencies are things such as teaching loads, reassigned time, the appropriate level of administration that we need to run a college. Perhaps we've got too many associate deans. Perhaps we have too many assistant department heads. Perhaps we don't have enough assistant department heads to effectively run the program. But we've got to be asking those questions. And I saw this on Facebook a few weeks ago, and I thought this pretty well captures, I think it's cute, but pretty well captures what we might often have, is that we've got a branch manager and we've got an assistant branch manager. And when I looked at this, in addition to thinking that's kind of clever, but I thought, does that branch even need moved? That's a question we ought to be asking ourselves. And second, what value added is that assistant branch manager providing? And we're asking that question within the A&M system. What should be moved, if you will, in that branch example? And if it does need moved, what kinds of resources are needed in order to achieve that? And not just throwing things at it, but rather wisely making those kinds of choices. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you a quick overview of what's going on within the A&M system, and certainly if there's questions as we go forward, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you, James. We'll turn to Stephanie's presentation next.
First of all, I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to speak on this critically important topic. This is a topic that is the forefront of our system, and particularly our chancellor. I'm going to skip, let's see if I can. I can operate the technology. Here we go. I gave you a more extensive presentation than I really have time to present here, but if you want to go back and look at the slides, I encourage you to do that. First of all, as you all know, we have an extensive data dashboard, but I wanted to make the point that the dashboard is not simply a mechanism for delivering data. Our chancellor laid out a very specific framework for excellence. It is an action plan for our institutions to improve, and he has essentially provided a roadmap for how he wants those institutions to improve. There are several important areas that the framework focuses on, and a few of those: student success, faculty productivity, research and tech transfer, productivity and efficiency in terms of finances, and of course healthcare and the health of Texas for our health institutions. Our dashboard was put together to strategically look at the progress of our institutions in meeting those goals of the framework. And this is a very busy slide, but I wanted to mention that it's a primary goal of our system that policymakers, legislators, our constituents, the public are able to access and use our data easily in a way that they can understand it. And so we have actually developed a new data tool that is on our dashboard called Visual Analytics, and it's an iPad app. So now when our executives, when the public, when people are in meetings and they need data, they can pull up the dashboards on their iPad. And one of the things that we're doing is starting to place the data actually in context on the iPad. So you're not just seeing a table of enrollment, but you might see enrollment in comparison to other institutions in Texas, in the nation, enrollment trends. And this is also available to the public and for anyone here to use, and the iPad app is free. So now I want to talk about how we use data. And the data is not simply for accountability, but it's also for decision making. We really like to emphasize that all good decisions are based in solid data analysis. Similar to what was described by the A&M system, we also have a process of peer selection. We have baseline peers. Those are the peers sort of how you are now, your aspirational peers, where you want to go in 10 to 15 years. And then we've asked our institutions to go through a process of benchmarking. Where are you now? Where do you think you can get relative to your current peers and your aspirational peers? And they've set goals. And so we have the top quintile of baseline performers as mid-range goals, and long-term goals are the bottom quintile of the aspirational performers. And those are set for 2015, 2020, and 2025. So we have actual goals that the institutions have made and are public and stated. So it really makes it real. When you put it out there for the world to see, that brings some real accountability. And this is a very busy slide that you can go back and study later, but it really describes the statistical process that we use to select the baseline and our aspirational peers. And we looked at things like student body mix in terms of percent minority. We looked at Pell eligibility. We looked at program mix, research focus, those types of things to help find our peer institutions. And this was a collaborative process that we did with the campuses, with the presidents, and with the provost. Oops. So now I want to talk a little bit about benchmarking. And this is a standard bar chart which shows our institutions and the delta cost measures And if you look at it right now, you can say, okay, well, this is how much it costs for each institution to produce a degree. But if you look at this next slide, there we have the benchmarking. Now we're looking at our institutions in comparison to our baseline comparison group. So for instance, for Austin, UT Austin spent $18,000, $280 less than the institutions in its baseline comparison group. So you can see that it's not just, the previous slide was just the institutional data, but when you compare it with the baselines, then you're looking at performance. The next thing is goal setting. So earlier I was talking about the goals that the institutions had set, and this is one of the graphics that we use, and we have several different graphics like this where you're looking at graduation rates. So you can see the most recent actual data is the triangle, and this is for the University of Texas at Austin. So this is their current graduation rate. Where the X is at 55%, that's their 2015 goal. The 2020 goal, 70%, is the circle, and then if 2025 is the same. I mean, that's a pretty steep and trajectory. But this really, and you can see the top quintile, the peer average, and the peer bottom quintile. So you can really see performance relative to the peers and also where they're going. And so we try to use visuals like this so that you can quickly look at something, gather the information that you need. And I think it makes it more useful for many people. We also do a lot at our system of using data to inform policy making. Particularly, we have had a number of Regental-led task forces that also include some of our presidents and our deans. I think this has been really great for our system because it has allowed us the opportunity to get the greatest minds in the room regarding an issue, really study the data, talk about it, and come up with impactful policy solutions. We've had one on excellence in productivity, student debt reduction, and there's currently an ongoing task force on engineering education. Another thing that we do at our system often is provide data for ad hoc requests from the board to the chancellor, the legislature, the media, and others. And again, data is not just data. You have to put data in context. You have to talk about why it's significant, the number that you're looking at. You can't just provide a table without the important information to describe why it's relevant. So this is an example of some of the data we provided for one of our Regental task force on student debt. And you can see that the blue bars are the average debt per graduate, and then the orange bars are the average debt per borrower. And then you see the lines across for the national public average per graduate and then per borrower. So you're getting a sense of, for our graduates, what is their debt level compared to the other national public schools? Institutions, and again, what is their debt level for those who haven't graduated yet, who just borrowed or maybe didn't complete? It's actually quite a striking graphic to just peer comparisons aside, or to look at the difference between debt per graduate and debt per borrower. It really makes a statement about the importance of graduation, timely graduation. And again, this is another visual that we provided on student loan default rates. And so if you look at our institutions compared to the sort of Texas average for default rates for four-year public institutions. So this gives us an idea of, how well are we doing compared to others? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? Where do we need to focus our attentions to make important improvements? And some people have strong reactions to bubble charts. They're one of my favorites because I think they're really cool looking, but sometimes it can be difficult to read. You can see you have the reading score and the math score. The size of the bubble is determined by the percent of the cohort that's in the top 25% of the high school class. So the smaller the bubble, the fewer that you have that are in the top 25%. And obviously, the farther to the right the bubble is, the higher the reading and the math score was on the SAT. And so we can look at our institutions in terms of those students, and this was something that we looked at for Engineering and Computer Science Task Force, to look at, what is the quality, what are the qualifications of students that are actually coming into our engineering and computer science programs. And this is interesting in context because different institutions have different criteria for selection of students, and that drives the type of student that you get. Different institutions have different levels of prestige and offer different programs, and that also drives the type of students that you get. But I think it does give you a quick idea of what the entering standard of the student is for each institution. Another thing that the regents looked at, and the presidents and the deans, was sort of starting salary for engineering and computer science graduates in particular areas, from computer engineering to civil engineering, and then average starting salary for all graduates for the class of 2012. And this is an interesting graphic where it looks at work-life earnings for engineering, and you can look at, over a lifetime, if you are in a particular profession in engineering and you have a bachelor's versus a master's, and what area of specialization you're in, what are your potential work-life earnings. This could be something powerful that you could use for students thinking about majoring in engineering. So again, a big emphasis of our system is really using data to inform policy, and we're really reaching out to try to find as much data as we can to do that. And I'm really excited that we have a new agreement with the Texas Workforce Commission, where we are going to get longitudinal data on salary of our students within the UI wage record database in Texas. But the other piece of that I'm even more excited about is that we're going to get data on our students through the wage record interchange system too. So we will now be able to know for our students who leave Texas what state they've gone to and what salary they've made. In addition, we will also be able to connect this to our student level data and look at student performance. We can look at their GPA, we can look at the number of years to graduation, we can look at them several years after they've graduated. We can do longitudinal analysis, and we can also look at things like first generation status and major. So I'm really excited about this data. We're also working with the National Student Clearinghouse as a system. A lot of our campuses work individually with the National Student Clearinghouse, but our system is currently negotiating an agreement where the system will have access to the National Student Clearinghouse data. This will allow us to see for those students who did not graduate, who did not go on to work after they're receiving their bachelor's degree, where they went to graduate school, what they majored in. So it's another piece of the pie to let us know how well we are preparing our students. And we can also, another thing that the Engineering Task Force was particularly interested in was for those students who have applied to our schools and were not accepted, where did they go? Or for those students who applied to our schools but then declined and decided not to go, where did they go? So it's giving us an idea of decision-making trends for our students and might help us better target our policies. And these are just some things I think everyone has mentioned. You need to be smart. You need to put the data in context. Data should tell a story. Not all data are consumer savvy, which is why we like to use a lot of, or not all consumers are data savvy, which is why we like to use a lot of visualizations so that you can look at something. And people are busy, frankly. People don't have time to flip through a humongous notebook of, tables and things. We want to really put the impactful things up front, make it a quick glance, get the information you need, and you can go on, because that's how our people who make policy are going to use the data. Thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephanie. And last but not least, Perry.
Thank you, Fred. Well, it's good to be here this morning. It is still morning.
Just barely.
Come up last. I feel a little bit like James's assistant branch manager. But anyway, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and tell you a little bit about the Texas State University system and our emphasis on productivity. I might just note that it starts at the system office, and Charles is probably aware of that, having been the past chancellor. We have just over 20 people in our system office. So when I'm out talking to folks and they are talking about the academic division, I say, well, you're looking at it. It's me. I do have an administrative assistant. I have to share that person with the Vice Chancellor for Governmental Relations. And at this time of the year, when session is in, I get about a quarter of that administrative assistant. But I think it's important that you lead by example. And this is true for the system as well as in our institutions. In our dashboard, and it is a dashboard, it's not an encyclopedia. Whenever I think about a dashboard, I think about, for example, in olden days when we had bulletin boards and it was full of stuff. And as a dean, I always try to say, I control the bulletin boards. The faculty, you don't control them. Because if you only have a few things on there, on that bulletin board, they will be noticed. If it's full of stuff, probably people will not even look at it. So I think that the dashboards, if you're going to get the attention of campuses, need to be that. They need to be, as in your car, a relatively simple dashboard. So you see a number of things that we do look at, and you know you've already heard about these. Employment of graduates. We start with that one. Degrees awarded. Credit hours taught by faculty. Student-to-faculty ratios. The enrollment growth. Head count and credit hours. The state appropriations per degree, state appropriations per full-time student equivalent, graduation rates, and degrees awarded per 1,000 students. Others that we will add to this soon. The average debt for all graduates, which you've just heard about. Another way of perhaps that we want a different way of examining space. I think the coordinating board does a good job of it, but it's not intuitive when you look at it as to what it means. So I'm going to play around with this a bit and see if we can come up with a better indice, a better index that the average Joe in the university and outside the university might understand. And another one I want to look at is undergraduate degree efficiency, taking the full-time student equivalents at the undergraduate level and divide that by the degrees awarded for the fiscal year at the undergraduate level. We want to also put on our dashboard the transfer students as a percent of total enrollment and degrees earned by transfer students as a percent of total degrees in a particular year. And then we have this information, but we don't have it on that dashboard, and that is total revenue for the institution per degree. We also have, in addition to our productivity dashboard, an annual evaluation of presidents by the chancellor. And in that, we look at all of these items and ask for goal settings in all of these areas for the coming year. And we also look at a couple of other things. We look at the administrative cost as a percent of the total operating budget, the student credit hours taught online, because it relates directly to the use of facilities and to capital expenditures. We look at student credit hours taught at 8 a.m. Charles smiles. At 8 a.m., Friday afternoon, and on Saturday. And the coordinating board would be happy with this. We also look at number of low-producing programs from year to year. How many were low-producing in one year? How many are low-producing in a subsequent year? And number of programs requiring more than 120 hours in one year and then in the next year. We also gather on this presidential evaluation diversity data for all students and faculty at all ranks. We look at research revenues and at gifts for the prior year and ask for goal setting in these areas. Then we ask the president personally to assure that performance evaluations have been done on every single employee, every faculty member, every staff member, and that they're based on merit reviews, not on anything else but merit reviews. I was also on the coordinating board's advisory committee on measuring or evaluating advising. I asked for that. I rarely ask for any position or any of these things that the coordinating board has. And they're generally happy that I haven't asked. But I did ask for this one because of the importance I attach to advising. I think it's one of the most undervalued activities in our institutions, and particularly in our institutions that are overwhelmingly teaching institutions. So I asked to be on it, and of course they produced a report. And I want each president to assure that they are evaluating advising, particularly for the professional advisors, but also, for example, where you have faculty who have significantly reduced loads to engage in advising. I don't think it's as important for the average faculty person because they're not doing all that much. That could be good or bad, advising. And they're certainly not doing a lot of career advising. But we do believe that career and academic advising should be integrated and merged. And we want the president to assure us each year that advising has been evaluated. Some of the ways that the use of the data has changed our behavior. We have, emphasize this again, emphasized more advising. The SAM Center at Sam Houston State is an excellent model for how to engage the students in advising, particularly in their first year. The PACE Center at Texas State emulates, they don't think this at Texas State, but it does, the SAM Center, and integrates academic and career advising for the first year student. If you can't get that student to a second year, you don't need to worry about graduation rates. So, and much of that is dependent upon the advising they get. So we've moved to implement best practices also in retention at a number of our campuses, at least to the extent that they have the resources to do it. Sul Ross right now is engaged in a major consulting agreement with Noel Levitz to assure that we are implementing the best practices available for retention of students. We've also integrated and implemented more orientation sessions for our new students concerning debt and how easily you can get into excessive amounts of debt in a hurry as a student before you know it. And they most assuredly need to know when they borrow that you can't take bankruptcy and get out from under it. It is one of those things that will go with you for life. These are just some of the things we're doing with it. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Barry, thank you. That was, I think hearing each of those four presentations not only underscores the fact that there's no dust gathering under any of our systems or institutions in terms of embracing and moving forward with accountability and measuring performance, but also the diversity of approaches, and yet much of the data and much of the metrics also have a commonality in terms of their priority. Members, I can't believe you won't have any questions, and while we're facing lunch, I know you're fast eaters, so let's take about 10 minutes to ask what questions you may have jotted down. Jerry?
Not so much a question, but an observation, which I think is really good from where we started a few years ago, and that is that all of the systems, you can tell, get it. They are dedicated to collecting the data and using it and analytically to make decisions. But the thing that really I'm impressed with is that all of you have seemed to understand, which I think is a true statement, that one size does not fit all, that you've done this with the bottoms-up, mostly bottoms-up approach with some top-down direction, but it hasn't been all top-down. And I think you're to be commended for that, because these institutions are so vast and got a lot of inertia, like turning a battleship. and if you don't get them to buy in from the bottom up, you don't have a chance. And so that's more of an observation. I think it really, from where we were a few years ago, that recognition that the people that are where the rubber meets the road can solve this issue, or continuing an issue and continuing improvement that we're trying to find, is going to come from the people that make it happen.
I think that's well put. Thank you, Jerry. Ray, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Renu, you mentioned about the 10% of the faculty that oppose everything and the 10% that get on board and the 80% in the middle. And one of the other speakers spoke about getting the advisors with the students in their freshman year, talking about career and debt and so on. Is there any effort in any of the institutions to take those faculty members when they join the institution to do team building and rally them around the mission of the university, as opposed to being what faculty members can be sometimes?
I'd like to jump on that, and I would assume that this is happening in many institutions. I don't think this is unique to the A&M system, but one of the things that I think when some of us may have come along, faculty orientation was a half-day talking head kind of experience, and then you went off and really you were socialized by your colleagues in the department. And so if you were hanging out with faculty who were lazy, you saw that as the way to be. If you were hanging out with faculty who were industrious, you saw that as the way to be. What I think is happening across most institutions, and certainly we've systematically been pushing this in the A&M system, is making the first-year faculty, the junior faculty process, part of a very strategic socialization of those faculty into what we want them to be as faculty members in our institutions, such that for everyone it's a year-long process in that first year, and then they move into junior faculty learning communities and those kinds of things to try to make a difference. And ultimately, a faculty member may choose poorly, but we try to get rid of them when they do. But we are strategically and intentionally making efforts to try to get faculty, as they join our institutions, to think differently than perhaps faculty 10, 15, 20 years might have.
So in terms of my role, other than chancellor, I'm also president, and that means I am a lot more in campus, with the faculty and all. And one of the things that I always do is to highlight those faculty who really are into that national game and who are productive, no matter what settings, no matter what kind of speeches I'm giving, no matter where I am recognizing people. And that slowly starts to really shift the culture. People start to realize it's in fashion, actually, to be doing these good things. And then I have been very lucky that way, that I've got very good partnership and leadership in the faculty senate. And, that does really a lot of, I think it takes a lot of burden away, but engaging them and keeping them as partners, that has been, I guess I've done it naturally because I was president of Faculty Senate in my previous life. So that's what I tell them. I say, I remember where you are, that's where I was, and I understand and appreciate what you do. However, then, the things that are really important, one of the things what I keep telling them, I say, I will never believe that you are ready to become an excellent institution until you have the courage and the guts to separate mediocrity from excellence. Until you can say this is mediocre. If everybody says they're excellent, I know that's not true, and that's what happened with me when I came and I visited every single college. The college says, we're the best. So great, tell me how, where, show me the evidence. Well, nobody has the evidence because they aren't. So I think that has really allowed our junior faculty, and I personally meet with them twice a year because I want them to know how valuable they are, and these are my priorities, these are the institutional strategic goals. And I think it just gives them the sense of empowerment to be able to do things otherwise they would not with their colleagues.
Beth?
My takeaway from all of this is I love the numbers of this, and I'm thrilled that y'all are following them. I'm particularly the UT system. I can hardly wait to get online and fool around with it. And you will send the PowerPoint that, I'd love to see the rest of that. Oh, good. Oh, it's in the flash drive.
Everything we've seen is on the flash drive.
My life is in a flash drive. If only I could put this in my head, it would just solve so many problems. And I can say firsthand, I have watched University of Houston, and under Renew's leadership, it is driven by figures. It is driven by there's no generalizations here at all. And what University of Houston and its sister institutions are doing in our city are really phenomenal. And Dr. Couture has reshaped the faculty to think of not just the institution of, this is University of Houston, but it's really what the product of our universities are that is important. And that's what they are excited about, and that's what you become a faculty member about and do your disciplines, is the things that mean, and that she has made it very cogent, and it's really, really close. And anyway, I want to brag on you a little bit, Dr. Couture. So she really has moved the needle here, and I think that having numbers is just crucial.
Lee, you had a question?
Well, I agree that having numbers is crucial, but I know that all my colleagues have had this experience. It is pretty easy to collect too many numbers in higher education also. The harder part is to decide which benchmarks actually matter, which of them do you make uniform, which of them do you allow variations among the campuses, when do you benchmark against which peers. So my hat's off also. These are all very impressive systems. The change I've seen over 10 years as chancellor is that the initial efforts, sort of like the launch of the voluntary system of accountability, were designed for external audiences. They were to placate those who said we had to have some numbers, so we came up with some numbers. They weren't really numbers to drive data-driven decision-making. They weren't really for internal use. They were for show. May have been an important show, but these sort of systems are very different. I just had two questions or comments, really. In a few areas, it's not clear whether you've yet decided how much variation to allow. The UT system has talked quite a lot about the collegiate learning assessment. But when you get down to areas like student outcomes and measuring learning, there are a lot of voices that say, oh, that has to be done very differently. Different campuses have different cultures. They have different academic areas of focus. And so not everyone has done that as uniformly. The same's true in student engagement. I notice, Renew, that you have, for different campuses, some different questions from the National Student Engagement Exam that are more important on some campuses than on others. So the reflection of how you connect to the community is not yet just one single number. It's a variation. And my other comment was about administrative cost measure, which the state asks us all for one measure of administrative cost as a percentage of our operating budget, I think it is. And it's not a particularly useful measure. It doesn't actually reflect anything that varies year to year based on the budgets. It's also inversely proportioned to research, because the more successful you are in research, the more of your utilities and overhead you load onto your research budgets, and you end up looking like you have a very low administrative cost. So one of the metrics that we're still searching for is how do we measure, if we're trying to reduce the back office cost and put as much as possible into the classroom, do you try to go and measure those inputs more finely, squeeze them, or do you just look at the cost of degree and cost of degree to your peers, as the UT charts were showing? You could argue to just look at the outcome. If you're delivering a degree of high quality at a lower cost than your peers, how much time do you really want to spend on whether your utility costs are 1 penny above average? On the other hand, as a campus administrator, you may want that data precisely to try to go there to find how to have more money for faculty salaries. That's an area where there hasn't been much done yet that's useful to truly measure the non-direct academic overhead cost.
I knew we should have put you on this panel.
I like being up here.
Would any of you like to respond to Lee's points? Perry?
I agree completely in terms of how many data points one can look at for a particular institution and what you need to compare that to for that institution. when it comes to presidential evaluations, as the chancellors know, it's a very multifaceted thing, and even if you are concerned about one particular data point, you want it to increase, if, on the other hand, that president has been marvelous at raising external funds and has an excellent community support, I mean, what are you going to do because they're not performing outstandingly on what you thought was going to be a major data point for that institution? So it gets very complex when it gets down to, I believe, in measuring presidential performance. But to give you one example for us, and for me personally, at Lamar University, I believe one thing and I was very engaged in the search for the new president there, who's the business dean at the University of Oklahoma, Ken Evans, who will come down and be president at Lamar. From me, as the chief academic officer, I believe President Evans needs to be very much concerned about graduation rates at Lamar. Period. I mean, I don't have anything else to talk to him about but that. And I believe I have to do it in that way in order to get that individual's attention. I can't talk about 20 things with that president because they're going to be doing that in the community. They're going to be doing that at Lamar. But he needs to know, coming from me at the system office, he may get another thing from Brian McCall, the chancellor, but from me, the vice chancellor for academic affairs, I'm going to be talking about those graduation rates and how we can improve them over time. And so I agree with you, Chancellor. It is very important to be selective from the system office in terms of what you address at the institutional level and to have the appropriate comparative indices when you make that assessment.
Just to add to that, and I think you make a really interesting point about perspective, and we talk about this quite a bit, is what is the information that we want to present to our stakeholders as a system? What's useful in terms of national benchmarking? What data is, a lot of times, what you can benchmark as a system for your campuses is somewhat dependent on availability of other national and state level data in order to do that benchmarking. But then there's this issue of what kind of decisions do you need to make when you're running a campus? And those are business decisions that are driven by an entirely different set of data and really needs and concerns. And I think the one you brought up about operational costs is extremely important. The question then becomes for the system, is there a way that we could take that information and look at it in the aggregate? Is it useful to look at the information in the aggregate like that? And so it's this sort of back and forth between this idea of data for operational day-to-day decision making and data for state and national benchmarking and our constituents.
If I could, just one more funny story that occurred to me while she was giving that answer. I have 6 finance and accounting professionals on our Board of Regents. And as you can imagine, they have a particular enthusiasm and a focus on the quality of the budget process and how much analysis has been given. And they've spent 2 years asking for an improved budget reporting process, getting down into details. Our 3 campuses are very anxious that they're somehow interested in micromanaging. And we finally got a report at the last board retreat that had an awful lot of detail. And the presidents gently said, but you know, this is really not where the board ought to be. And the same board members who asked for the information said, you're right. But you didn't have this information when we asked 2 years ago, and all we want to know is that you're using this data.
Absolutely.
That is a good story. You know, Lee asked about variability between your campuses, and I am curious, are they, the Empower Use deal at A&M is measuring student learning outcomes. It also applies, I think, maybe variability on benchmarking, Stephanie. So my 2 questions are, what tools are the campuses choosing? Is it different for the different members of the A&M system on student learning outcomes? And kind of the same question on choosing who are the peer institutions to benchmark against, because my assumption would have been that you have some similar campuses within the UT system that would have shared the same peer group, but it doesn't appear from the charts that they're exactly necessarily the same peer groups. So.
Yes, there are some measures that we have to have the same measures on, and I think Renu illustrated that very clearly. We have to have good definitions. There's no reason for us to be using different definitions for graduation rates. We've got to have some standardizations. How far do you want to go on that is really the question. And in the A&M system, we have chosen to require and assure that all of the student learning outcome assessments are systematic and pervasive. Those are the two words I've been using, is that we've got to use systematic. So it's not something we just invented on our own or it's on the fly or something, but there are real nationally normed-based rubrics associated with it, and it must be pervasive. It's not something that's going to be done ad hoc, but rather all good samplings of our student body are represented in this process. But beyond that, we have decided that the campuses need to make the decision on the best way to assess communication within their campus, and even at a more micro level than that, at A&M, where you have 11 different universities and 70 some odd departments, there may very well be better ways of assessing critical thinking skills for this engineering department than that would not necessarily be appropriate for this English department. And so we've allowed that flexibility within some constraints, and we think that's a smart way to go. Obviously, if it becomes required that CLA or CLA Plus becomes our required measure, then we will adjust. But our philosophy at this point is to assure that it is happening and assure that it is happening well, but allow the flexibility of the campuses to decide how they're going to go about that.
We developed a statistical model to select our peers, and we worked with a group of provosts who had a lot of input on what the factors were that we were going to look at as part of this model. So basically, we weren't matching on outcomes, but we were matching on the characteristics of the campus. One of the really important factors was program mix, and that's important because, like UT Dallas, for example, very heavily STEM-based institution, a lot of expensive programs. A more comprehensive institution such as Brownsville or Pan American, a smaller institution, is going to have a less expensive program mix. So we wanted to make sure that when we were looking for peers that they were actually statistically similar on factors that all the provosts could agree were important. When we came out with the model, we actually did the analysis for the institutions, ran the models, and gave them a list of institutions that fell within a certain range. And then we allowed them to take that list back to their presidents and their provosts, and then they had a conversation about, okay, based on this list, what do we feel? We know these are statistically similar to us. Which 10 are going to be our peers? And so there may be a little overlap, but there wasn't quite as much as you might expect. But we really tried to use a process where we involved the campuses from the beginning. But it was also, like you said, was based on a process that everyone used. Everyone used the same factors. And that way it was very systematic and even.
Thank you. Charles, you had a question?
Well, I want to make a statement a little bit. I did a press conference last week on a report by the Complete College America folks. In fact, the previous Commissioner of Higher Education of Indiana, Stan Jones, is president of that. That caused me to think about a lot of this stuff. What Lee said was exactly right. A few years ago, we were manufacturing data because we were getting criticized, but we really weren't doing much with it. I'm just stunned at listening to this today at how you progressed in the last 3 or 4 years. And the message that I was doing in my press conference and my interviews and stuff that I did over several days was that higher education gets it. I mean, you folks are demonstrating that. You get the criticism. You've heard from the governor. You've heard from the legislature. You've heard from the taxpayers. You've heard from the students. And you're reacting. Unfortunately, the legislature and the public have not caught up with you. You're so far ahead of where they have any idea you are. And it's the real challenge is to try to get that message out. I mean, there was some foot dragging in the early days, and we all could tell our stories about that. Everybody was comfortable and didn't want this criticism. The criticism has been very good, and I'm so proud of the way the institutions have reacted. It's amazing.
Perception is reality, so we need to help you bring perception up to the status of reality. Elaine, you had a question or a
Just
comment?
to follow up to your question, Mr. Chairman, about the process of evaluating the learning outcomes across our vast system at A&M. What they have done to take it a step further is not only enable each college and in some cases the departments to pick their instrument, but what they've done is been able to take that information and roll it up and kind of do a bridge study so that they're quantifying at a high level, so the regents at the Regenta level, we can check how well they are doing without having to understand each of the different numerical values in some cases of each instrument or assessment. So they've been able to, number one, come up with a common definition for each of the learning outcomes. Our system has one common definition for each of those. Then again, work with each of our institutions to ensure they are being measured in a timely manner. Those outcomes will be reported to us, but in a common language so we can easily assess, back to Stephanie's driving point about using the data well and right and visualizing, we can easily assess how our campuses are doing to the college and, if necessary, to the department level on adding value vis-a-vis the learning outcomes and make sure our quality is high.
Now that makes sense. That puts it in context. So today, not only have we learned about how to herd cats with milk bowls, how to put couples in canoes to see how long it takes to.
I caused a divorce doing that one day.
We've also learned the proper and correct usage of the word regental, which I didn't even know existed before today. So, gosh, there's just a lot of takeaways. We've got about 6 minutes to get our sandwiches and have a working lunch. Are there any last burning questions we can't live without? Because I know our panelists must be hungry as well. If not, thank you very much. It's been a very good presentation, very enlightening. Our small group discussions in the next 29 minutes. Susan is going to walk us through a proposed timeline for moving forward with our next long-range plan.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, how you doing?
Beyond closing the gaps, in terms of how we will, the proposals we've discussed previously will evolve. One of the strengths of closing the gaps by 2015 has been the buy-in and the strong support from all of our stakeholders, the state's educational, business, and political communities. As the Council strives to establish the beginnings of our next long-range plan for higher education in Texas, a mechanism is going to be needed to seek feedback on the 4 potential goals that we're now considering under our overarching goal of 60% of Texans holding post-secondary attainment. So, Susan, why don't you present this timeline, and then we'll segue into brief presentations of the small group summaries.
Okay, and all of you have this timeline in your packet, so I'm not going to read it to you. I will just hit some of the highlights. At this meeting, we're going to present this timeline and hopefully have everybody agree that this is good. In July, we'll be providing y'all with more data on each of those 4 goals and try to get some consensus along that, and then finalize this, get your recommendations on this timeline, and then present that timeline to the coordinating board in July. In October, we will be having our Texas Leadership Conference, so we'll be sharing the major goals, that sort of thing, with all of the regents and trustees that come to that leadership conference, and getting that information out to them and working with them on that. In August, then in December, we will be identifying members for this other committee, for the committee that will actually develop the plan. So we want the regents and trustees to be aware of what we're talking about before we start asking for input on members, that sort of thing. So we'll ask the members, and then in December we will. David has something to say.
I just want to. Key point here for this is what we're recommending is that you prepare sort of the real strong starting point for a separate committee on beyond closing the gaps. And I think that's the main takeaway. So the idea is that what you've done be well vetted as much as can be before our January board meeting, then that be taken to our board member. Then in February we start with an actual planning committee. be different than this one in a number of ways. Number one is that it would have to be monthly. Our progress, you have to meet every month. You can't have several months to be in between, then you meet for a little over a year. And then make that proposal to the board, and there'll be time before that committee would be taking the plan to the board in July 2015 for final approval. But the plan would be done several months before that, so there could be some additional vetting with institutions. The success of closing the gaps was really, and if Pam Williford were here, she could talk to this specifically. We spent a lot of time vetting with institutions, and even though you may end up with something that looks very similar to what your proposal is, that you take a lot of that tweaking that can occur over 12 months really makes it a much better plan. The proposal originally to our Closing the Gaps Committee had 3 goals. It looked in some ways remarkably similar to the final plan, but after 12 months, it was much, much better plan than that first. Adding the nuances, and people really understood what was being proposed. I just wanted to make sure that that's a highlight.
So to be clear, then the goal would be to go through this, the stakeholder input, the vetting, the collaboration, so that when in July of 2015, the coordinating board would be adopting a finished, agreed upon, 15-year plan.
Yes.
So to
But
speak.
that would not mean that the interaction with the institutions would stop at that point, just like as we have with Closing the Gaps.
Didn't during
Continuous.
Closing the Gaps,
Yes.
yeah. And we reset those benchmarks at least once.
Correct.
Okay. Any questions about the timeline before we go to our group summaries or thoughts? If you do study this when you get a chance, and if you've got any thoughts about the progression, the timeline, please feel free to share those with Susan and David and the rest of the council. All right. Are we going in group order?
Yes, group number 1, representative.
Our spokesman is Fred.
I think I've got to come down there and read my own hand. So, group 1, Charles and Ray and Elaine and I, we were sort of stepping back and maybe considering this as a big picture. What's the role of the council in developing a culture in Texas higher ed that's dedicated to continuous improvement of educational outcomes? And we came up with 5 ideas. The first one really was based on the panel that we heard today. That was really, can we continue to encourage and facilitate the kind of collaborative discussion with institutional leadership? And then I'll get to this later, but we had the thought maybe this turns into some sort of an annual event or conference. Some of us couldn't help today but notice that when we had our Brenda's presentation and our 4 panelists up here, that they were listening to one another and taking notes from one another.
The facial reactions were great. Wish we'd have had a camera.
Hopefully, we won't know for a while, but hopefully maybe some folks had some aha moments today. And so that collaborative sharing is one valuable role that could be played. Then as we talked about that further and later on, we also recognize that this council, depending on how it's structured, structure may change or its affiliation. We thought, this is a group that could, council, or maybe more importantly, by inviting participants, engage in disruptive brainstorming. In other words, if we're not, board of an agency, and if we're not on the representing an institution, and if we're not an elected official, then maybe we can facilitate saying what we really think and just coming up with ideas that aren't politically correct. What is this?
Microphone.
Oh, sorry. Can you? I guess the internet can't hear me. Oh, okay. Is it on? All right. So disruptive brainstorming was part and parcel of the idea of collaborative discussion. And not only, as I mentioned, ideas share, but one of the other products of that role, that event, could be promoting public awareness. And I'll come back to some examples of that, but as we recognize, more than one of you recognize today, our institutions and systems are really moving a lot faster than both policymakers and the public and the parents necessarily realize and understand. So we also started talking about, well, there's a lot of different dashboards. Should this council have, a statewide dashboard? Well, I think the obvious thing is that the long-range plan on which we've been working, those metrics are our statewide dashboard. And just like closing the gaps, one role could be, how do we help the institutions adopt and share in their portion of whatever the Beyond Closing the Gaps is called. Continue benchmarking Texas versus high-performing states and countries is another role that the council can play. And then finally, and I think this might have been Charles's term, I'm not sure, but the council could serve as the conscience of Texas higher education, if you will. So, which would be an ongoing role because we all know we need a conscience, don't we? Briefly, we recognize that a lot of the ideas we've talked about are really build upon one another. They're complementary and not either or choices. For example, the dashboards. And
you're going to have to explain what those.
I know. I am not an artist, so I will explain. They were making fun of my drawings. So the dashboards and the accountability systems that support them. I used a construction metaphor, not surprisingly, are like the blueprints, or so I don't show my age, as Charles said, or as Ray said, rather. It's like the BIM model, the 3D BIM model. The responsibility center management is really like the structure. It's how you would structure your project team or your profit centers. That is the responsibility and the structure for your people who are going to build your project. And then lean continuous improvement and the various concepts within lean are the toolbox. That's not a lunch pail, that's a toolbox. So these are all things that can be used together. And as Elaine pointed out, funding, not only aligning funding, but in the last session, the lack of funding was the necessity that was the mother of invention. And sort of a spark to a lot of this effort. So this is really kind of a continuing process where all these things can work together and complement. And then lastly, and this will take me back to the event idea, second question was, how can the council play a role in identifying best practices? And really, a lot of the ideas we were talking about were, it's not so much our role to identify and say, that's a best practice, go and do. This council and bodies like it really can act as the catalysts for helping our institutions and our systems identify and share what those best practices are. And we thought a couple of structural things. One was having that annual innovation summit. Maybe this council can be the precursor to creating this summit that becomes like Jackson Hole conferences to economics, or the Aspen Institute to whatever it is they do at the Aspen Institute. Or the Sundance Film Festival, or the.
Fred, are we going to meet there?
We're gonna meet at your. Don't you have a ranch in New Mexico we could use? So, but you get the idea. Hopefully, we couldn't remember the name of the group that meets in the Grove outside San Francisco, but the Bohemian. Yeah, I knew somebody would. The Bohemian Club. That's sort of the idea, and it would also help promote public awareness. And then lastly, there's some thought that rather than this council necessarily be an appointed advisory body of the coordinating board, maybe there were two thoughts, and we didn't really decide which is best. Maybe it could become affiliated with our independent foundation, the College for All Texans Foundation, and be an adjunct or part of that foundation. Or you could go the other direction and consider having this become a publicly appointed standing blue ribbon council where the governor, the speaker, and the lieutenant governor perhaps have their members. So those are a couple of structural models that we could consider as we go forward. Who's going to speak for Group 2?
drawing was outstanding.
Okay, on group 2, it was Harold Lee and myself. And on the first question, how we can play a role in the culture of educational outcomes, first of all, we said we needed to start with the definitions of the educational outcomes. And it really comes down to quality, quantity, and value, and how that translates into academic success and workforce impact. And then having recognition of efficiencies and progress, recognize the progress on those key metrics. We didn't go into all the conferences, but we kind of like that idea. So, and then on the second question, how the council can have an impact on best practices in campus operations. And we were very skeptical of best practices, how we really define that. Caution with that term. We felt we still had to come back and define the key indicators. And an example we gave is administrative cost measures. There aren't good measures out there around administrative cost measures. And so how do you start defining where you can really get some efficiencies and understand administrative costs? And what are those appropriate measures? For example, if you looked at net energy per square foot and started how you really calculate those kinds of things also. Reducing non-academic expenditures, but again, coming up with clear definitions around that. Again, continuing STAR awards and recognition, because that recognition allows others to see what's being done and then to explore and see how it could impact their institution. Anything else, Harold and Lee?
Great.
Okay. And the third team?
Behold's still on your board. Don Behold's still on your board.
Mm-hmm.
Just barely.
Just barely. Are they in this end of May? He's not applying, as I understand.
Well, in a close vote, we decided not to kill the council. Although we did talk about it. I think most of what we're going to say here is, or what I'm going to say about our group has been said in one way or another. We did, I think, and this is more of a personal opinion, although I brought it up, and I think the group agreed with it, that we see this council as advisory to the coordinating board, because we're not going to do anything on our own that the board doesn't approve and carry forward as a policy. My personal opinion, it would be better to keep it that way rather than going public, because the appointment process right now, as I understand it, is you look around and try to find out who in the state can help you, and you bring them in and do that. I think that's a perfect role for the chairman of the coordinating board to serve in this as chairman of this group, but get the people you need to help you without a political process with, oh, I got a friend over here that wants to do that, and I think it'd be better to leave it like it is.
Now the way you got appointed.
Yeah. Heldenfels calls and says, I want you. So, that was it. So I think you ought to keep it that way. But we didn't discuss that specifically, but I think we see ourselves as advisory to the coordinating board. You can take our good ideas and implement them, and our bad ideas, you can throw them out. We do think a role that we could serve very well is to promote and encourage the RCM approach. And we don't mean to implement it necessarily, but encourage every institution, system and university, to consider it, to consider the idea. And I think Phil made a good point in our discussion that this doesn't have to be by some pure definition of RCM. What you need to do is tie revenue to expenditure. That's the process that you're in. Did I say that right? So anyhow, the organizations, different universities have implemented it slightly differently in some cases. And so we think that ought to be allowed, but they ought to consider it. And as Phil said, you'll find a zillion reasons at every institution why they can't do it or don't want to do it or something, but at least you got to get it out on the table. And perhaps the council is a place that we can keep it on the table. And I even had the idea, or I think it'd be a good idea for the next several meetings, if we could have, every time I've heard about it, I've learned a little more. I learned a lot more today. And if we could have maybe a 15 or 30-minute presentation by someone that has done it and done it successfully, tell us how they did it, what problems they were in, to how they handled them, et cetera, et cetera. It might be good for all of us to get our gyros spun up a little faster on what it's all about. What I missed in that? Anything? We talked about the best practices, and we had the same concerns that we're not in a great position to be able to define those. But we are, and this is where I think we really agree with the first two groups, that we really are maybe the only place that can be discussed in a forum where it can be shared, because we notice the same things. People taking notes. We've got 2 members of the coordinating board that heard it. We've got all of us. We've got the staff that heard what was said today in those 4 presentations, and there probably are some aha moments amongst all of them. And so we think that's a good thing to continue. And perhaps make that annual idea of being that one conference where we bring all these ideas of innovation and performance measurement and so forth together might be a great idea. Anything else?
We did talk about, as far as bringing things forward, that we ourselves aren't going to come up with all the best ideas. But the coordinating board staff, if they would bring those to us for our consideration, for our evaluation to look at, then that might be an effective way of doing this on an ongoing basis, to ask the coordinating board to identify what they think are best practices. The staff, to identify what they think are best practices, bring it to this group for our consideration, just to take a look at it. Among ourselves, it's kind of hard to do. We can go out on websites and just brainstorm it, but they're closer to the source, and I think could do it a little more effectively.
Serve sort of as a sounding board for evaluation.
That's correct. Yeah. Yes, sir.
And picking up on the idea that the staff hears a lot what's going on at institutions that we don't hear, and there may be a breakthrough idea in some of these places we ought to hear and evaluate. That's it.
Thank you, Jerry. Mary informed me that before we have a motion to adjourn, that it might be a good idea to approve the minutes from our last meeting.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
So we have a motion from Roberto, second from Charles and others. All in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. And I appreciate all the good work today. A lot of good ideas, I think, came out of this meeting. It was kind of an energizing meeting. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And thank you all for being here, because I know how busy each of you are. So with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Second from Roberto. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? You just stay here as long as you want. But we're done 10 minutes early.